Hearing will come to order. Hello, everybody, and welcome. I first want to thank Director Elmendorf for joining us again. We appreciate your taking time to meet with us today, and we know that this baseline was a little late because Congress was a little late. So I'm glad we got time to get to this. You have put together a very informative report. It does a great job of laying out the challenges we face. My main takeaway is this. We still have a lot of work to do. This year, we are going to run a deficit of $514 billion. Now, that's less than last year's, but it's nothing to brag about. In fact, the deficit will start growing in just 2 years. By 2022, we will be running trillion-dollar deficits again, even though we will be taking in a historically large share of revenue. So even though taxes are at a historically high place, we still got trillion-dollar deficits in the future. That's because spending will be growing twice as fast as revenue. So over the next 10 years, we will add $10 trillion more to our national debt for a grand total of $27 trillion. It is hardly time to start congratulating each other. Now, I was glad to see that we passed the bipartisan budget deal last year. I think it was a step in the right direction, but only a step. We need to do more. We need to do much more. And it's deja vu all over again, because we know what the problem is. Autopilot spending and interest payments are driving our debt. Interest alone will quadruple over the next 10 years. And Obamacare is clearly part of the problem. It adds trillions of dollars in government spending, and it has made things worse for our economy and for working families. By 2017, CBO projects that people will be working fewer hours precisely because of the incentives created in this law. The effect will be severe, as if 2.5 million people had stopped working full-time by 2024. Between 2017 and 2024, overall labor compensation will also decline. And these changes, they disproportionately affect low-wage workers. Translation, Washington is making the poverty trap much worse. Your report points out some weak spots in our economy. Low investment, high unemployment, people leaving the workforce. If we got our act together, we could start paying down our debt and give our economy the certainty that it needs. Tax reform, regulatory reform, energy development. I think all of these could help create jobs and increase take-home pay. If you could bring up from the CBO report, slide 2.8. This is a point I'd like to highlight. This report says that not only does the debt get worse, that we have slower economic growth compared to the last forecast, but what is particularly troubling is CBO's projection of the labor force participation. CBO says that about half of this decline is attributable to the aging of the population. This is what we knew. You know, baby boomers are coming, they're retiring, and fewer people are following them into the workforce. A problem we have had with us a long time that we have yet to solve. But most notably in this report is that CBO also says that government policies, especially the President's health care law, are discouraging work. Washington is making this problem worse. This does not have to be our fate. We need to reverse this decline. So I consider this report a call to action. We know what the problem is. We know how to fix this problem. And I believe we can work together to get it done. The debt won't take care of itself. It is up to us, the men and women in the representative branch of government who are elected to serve and represent them. We need to take action. So I want to thank you once again for this report, Dr. Elmendorf, for your time today. I look forward to a great conversation and to your testimony. With that, I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I join the chairman in welcoming you, Dr. Elmendorf, and thank you to you and your entire team for the good work you do. As I look over the most recent CBO report, it's a good news, bad news story. The good news is that we have seen economic growth over the last few years, and you project continued economic growth going forward. The economy has added over 8.2 million private sector jobs over the last 46 months. On the other hand, this report projects very sluggish growth in the job market. In fact, as I read it, you project that the average unemployment rate in 2014 will actually be higher than the unemployment rate in December of last year. And that clearly is not good news. In fact, page 3 of your report sums up this mixed story when it states, quote, economic growth is projected to be solid in the near term, but weakness in the labor market will persist. And that sums up our challenge. And it seems to me we should therefore take actions that are within the control of this Congress. Congress can change that trajectory. Your report is based on current law. But Congress can take action today that will actually change that story for the remainder of this year and increase job growth. And the President and House Democrats have put forward very clear ideas to do it. We have a jobs plan that calls for a significant additional investment in our national infrastructure, in our roads, in our bridges, in our broadband, to help boost our international competitiveness and put people back to work. We can increase the minimum wage, which allows more Americans to keep the fruits of their labor, and by putting more money in the pockets of relatively lower income individuals who tend to spend it more, they will create more demand in the economy. And at the same time, while we have a chronic problem with long-term unemployment, we can extend unemployment insurance to those now 1.7 million Americans. And as the Congressional Budget Office itself has said, that will actually create additional jobs this year, 200,000 being the last projection. So there are things that we could do today, Mr. Chairman, to get back to work and get the country back to work. And one thing we should not do is mess around with whether or not America pays its bills on time, because that will create uncertainty in the economy, and that will hurt economic growth and jobs. Now, Dr. Elmendorf, you've got a comprehensive report, but the one thing that's gotten all the attention, it's on the front page of all the papers, is the thing that Chairman Ryan referred to. And I have to say, this is an example of when one misinterpretation gets out of the box early and goes around the world, it takes the truth an awful long time to catch up. Because what we believe we should focus on is the availability of jobs today, whether or not there's a demand for jobs today. And instead, what the chairman was focusing on was beginning in 2017, when the economy gets back to full employment, as a result of the Affordable Care Act, more Americans will be able to voluntarily choose to work fewer hours or not take a job because they don't depend on that job anymore for the provision of health insurance. Because before the ACA, if you lost your job, you lost your health insurance. Now you can go to the exchange and get affordable health insurance. And as a result, people may choose differently. And I find it really kind of ironic that back in 2008, when Senator McCain proposed a health care reform plan, the Heritage Foundation and conservatives heralded it as a plan that would help break job lock. They said today leaving a job or changing jobs means leaving behind health insurance provided at the place of work. Individuals who work to take a better job or change careers or leave the workforce to raise a family or retire early take substantial risks. And by God, the McCain health care reform plan will end that job lock. Well, the Affordable Care Act does end that job lock. It allows Americans to choose to spend more time with their family or pursue their dreams. And that is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. What's a bad thing is the lack of available jobs today and the fact that here in the House, we have a one-note focus on trying to eliminate affordable care for millions of Americans rather than focus on creating more jobs for millions of Americans. That should be our focus, Mr. Chairman, and that is really the conclusion of this report if you look at the entire thing instead of a few paragraphs. And I thank you, Dr. Elmendorf, for your work.
Dr. Elmendorf, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Congressman Van Hollen, and members of the committee. I'm very pleased to be here today to discuss CBO's report on the outlook for the budget and the economy, as well as our companion report released yesterday that dug more deeply into the slow recovery of the labor market. Beginning with the budget, the federal budget deficit has fallen sharply during the past few years, and it is on a path to decline further this year and next year. We estimate that under current law, the deficit will total about $500 billion this year, compared with $1.4 trillion in 2009. At that level, this year's deficit would equal 3% of the nation's economic output, or GDP, close to the average percentage seen during the past 40 years. The baseline projections show what we think would happen to federal spending, revenues, and deficits over the next 10 years if current laws generally were unchanged. Under that assumption, the deficit is projected to decrease again in 2015 to about 2.5% of GDP. After that, however, deficits are projected to start rising, both in dollar terms and as a percentage of our nation's economic output, because revenues are expected to grow at about the same pace as GDP, whereas spending is expected to grow more rapidly than GDP. Why the more rapid spending growth? In our baseline, spending is boosted by four primary factors: the aging of the population, the expansion of federal subsidies for health insurance, rising health care costs per beneficiary, and mounting interest payments on federal debt. With no changes in the applicable laws, spending for Social Security will increase from about 5% of GDP in 2014 to 5.5% in 2024. Spending for the major health care programs, a category that includes Medicare, Medicaid, the Children's Health Insurance Program, or CHIP, and subsidies through insurance exchanges, will climb even more under current laws. And net interest payments by the federal government are also projected to grow rapidly, mostly because of the return of interest rates to more typical levels. In sharp contrast, the rest of the federal government's non-interest spending for defense, for benefit programs apart from the ones I just mentioned, and for all other non-defense activities is projected to drop from 9.5% of GDP this year to 7.5% in 2024 under current law. That would be the lowest percentage of GDP since at least 1940, which is the earliest year for which comparable data have been reported. Thus, a sharply increasing share of the federal budget will go toward benefits from a few large programs, and a shrinking share will go toward most of the rest of the government's functions under current law. The large budget deficits recorded in recent years have substantially increased federal debt, and the amount of debt relative to the size of the economy is now very high by historical standards. We estimate that federal debt held by the public will equal 74% of GDP at the end of this year and 79% in 2024 under current law. Such large and growing federal debt could have serious negative consequences, including restraining economic growth in the long term, giving policymakers less flexibility to respond to unexpected challenges, and eventually increasing the risk of a fiscal crisis. Turning to the economy, we expect that after a frustratingly slow recovery from the severe recession of 2007 to 2009, the economy will grow at a solid pace for the next few years, but will continue to have considerable unused labor and capital resources, or slack. Further growth in housing construction and business investment should raise output and employment, and the resulting increase in income should boost consumer spending. In addition, under current law, the federal government's tax and spending policies will not restrain economic growth to the extent they did last year. And state and local governments are likely to increase their purchases of goods and services, adjusted for inflation, after having reduced them for several years. As a result, our baseline shows inflation-adjusted GDP expanding more quickly from 2014 to 2017, an average rate of about 3% a year, than it did in 2013. We expect that those increases in output will spur businesses to hire more workers, pushing down the unemployment rate and tending to raise the rate of participation in the labor force, as some discouraged workers return to the labor force in search of jobs. That effect on participation will keep the unemployment rate from falling as much as it would otherwise. We project the unemployment rate will decline only gradually over the next few years, finally dropping below 6% in 2017, and then edging down further after that. Nevertheless, the labor force participation rate is also projected to decline further in the next few years, because according to our analysis, the increase in participation stemming from improvements in the economy will be more than offset by downward pressure from demographic trends, especially the aging of the baby boom generation. After 2017, when the demographic trends will still be unfolding, but the effects of cyclical conditions will, we expect, have largely waned, the participation rate is projected to decline more rapidly. That is the main reason why, beyond 2017, we project that economic growth will diminish to only a bit more than 2% per year, a pace that is well below the average seen over the past several decades. Thank you. Happy to take your questions.
All right. I have a few questions about the healthcare law and how it's affecting the labor market. What is your best estimate of the effect that Obamacare will have on the total number of hours worked, which is the issue we're talking about? I just want to make sure we accurately understand what it is you're saying.
Right. So we think that the Affordable Care Act will reduce the total number of hours worked in the economy by between 1.5% and 2% between 2017 and 2024 relative to what would have happened in the absence of that act.
What is that in equivalent FTEs, full-time equivalent workers?
So given the fact that the calculation that we've done to translate that suggests that's equivalent to between 2 and 2.5 million reduction in full-time equivalent employment.
So just to make sure everybody understands this, and I think reading the report, 2 million equivalent in 2017, 2.3 million equivalent in 2021, and 2.5 million equivalent in 2024, right?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
So just to understand this, it's not that employers are laying people off, it's that people aren't working in the workforce, aren't supplying labor to the equivalent of 2.5 million jobs in 2024, and as a result, that lower workforce participation rate, that less labor supplied, lowers economic growth.
Yes, that's right, Mr. Chairman.
So who are these workers? I mean, I know this is a statistical run, but who are the people typically in this category? What kind of worker from an income scale side are being affected by this?
So the effect is principally on the labor supply of lower wage workers. And the reason is that what the Affordable Care Act does is to provide subsidies focused on lower and lower middle income people to buy health insurance. And in order to encourage a sufficient number of people to buy an expensive product like health insurance, the subsidies are fairly large in dollar terms. Those subsidies are then withdrawn over time, withdrawn for people as their income rises.
Yeah, right.
And by providing heavily subsidized health insurance to people with very low income, and then withdrawing those subsidies as income rises, the Act creates a disincentive for people to work relative to what would have been the case in the absence of that Act. Now, these subsidies, of course, make those lower income people better off. This is an implicit tax, not the sort of tax we normally think about, where if the government raises our taxes, we are worse off and face a disincentive to work more.
Yeah.
By providing a subsidy, these people are better off, but they do have less of an incentive to work.
So
and
I
we think they will respond to that by working.
I guess I understand
less.
the better off in the context of health care, but better off in inducing a person not to work who's on the low income scale, not to get on the ladder of life, to begin working, getting the dignity of work, getting more opportunities, rising their income, joining the middle class. This means fewer people will do that. That's why I'm troubled by this. Look, in your report, you note we're seeing a significant decline in labor force participation rate as the population ages. That's figure 2.8. And I'll just make a point here. This is what's so concerning about this is, if I understand your point, a big part of this is something we already knew, which is boomers are retiring. So we're effectively basically doubling the amount of retirees we have in the country over a generation, and far fewer people are following them into the workforce. I think, just off the top of my head, it's something like a 100% increase in retirees and only like a 17% increase in the workers following them in. So that's already a problem, where we're not prepared for the boomers and their retirement. But what this is doing is it's adding insult to injury. You're saying because of government policies, as the welfare state expands, the incentive to work declines, meaning grow the government, you shrink the economy. Fewer people are going to be working, and the economy will be slower as a result. We have about $1 trillion in less revenue because of slower economic growth from your last forecast, which goes to the deficit, to the debt, and makes us that much less prepared to get ready for the baby boomers and to pay off this debt. So that, to me, is just jaw-dropping. If you look at this budget, and I'm rounding here, Social Security and Medicare nearly double over the window, the 10-year window. Medicaid more than doubles, but interest on the debt quadruples. Is that about right?
In nominal dollars,
Yeah,
yes, Mr.
right. So your baseline shows us that adding about $10 trillion to the debt over the next 10 years, which is a 57% increase in the amount of the national debt. At the same time, interest payments, as I mentioned, quadruple to $880 billion by 2024. Here's what I'm really worried about. You assume fairly stable interest rates. You assume a normalization of basically no inflation on the horizon over the decade, and the 10-year goes to like 4.8 or 5% at the end of the window.
Yes, 5%.
We've got a $4 trillion expansion of our monetary base. We are in uncharted territory with respect to monetary policy in the Federal Reserve. They've just begun to normalize. We're already seeing reverberations in the third world and the emerging markets, and they've only tapered a little bit. What happens if interest rates don't go as we hope they do? What happens if we have a spike in interest rates, say, for instance, just 1%? What if interest rates are just 1% higher than what you're projecting to these interest payments?
So, as you know, Mr. Chairman, we try to set our forecast to be in the middle of a distribution of possible outcomes. We think interest rates could be higher than we project, and we think they could be lower than we project.
So give me a sense of 1%.
We offer in an Appendix D of the report, as you know, Mr. Chairman, rules of thumb for how changes in economic conditions would affect the budget. And these are meant to be used only roughly. But this rough estimate is that an increase in interest rates being 1 percentage point higher than we project for the entire decade would increase the deficit by about $1.5 trillion over that period. And correspondingly, interest rates that were 1 percentage point lower than we project over the entire decade would reduce the deficit by about $1.5 trillion. And I would say, Mr. Chairman, that there is upward pressure on interest rates from the large amount of federal debt, and we take that on board in our projections. There is downward pressure on interest rates from the aging of the population. Economies with slower overall economic growth tend to have lower interest rates. We've taken that on board in our projections as well. And we do not see any sign of incipient inflation. Inflation over the past year has been unusually low, and inflation over the last half dozen years has been at or below the Federal Reserve's goal of 2%. So we do not see inflation as a substantial risk going forward, although like macroeconomists learn to never say never.
Right. Yeah, I mean, especially 10 years out, it's pretty hard to predict. Here's the issue. I think you could make a good case that the Federal Reserve has been basically bailing out fiscal policy for some time, since the crisis, by keeping interest rates artificially low and depressing the true fiscal picture that we have. Unfortunately, Congress did not take advantage of that moment to lock in a real fiscal consolidation plan, a long-term debt reduction plan to tackle our entitlements, which is what our budget that we've passed 3 years in a row did. Balanced the budget, paid off the debt, dealt with the entitlements. Now the Federal Reserve is normalizing. Now they're basically pulling back. They're still very loose because they're, I think, what, $65 billion a month?
Yeah, right. So as they would say, they're still buying more assets.
They're still buying more assets. So they're still expanding, just not as fast as they were before, but they're showing signs of normalization. We've never been in this territory before. We've never had this kind of a balance sheet. It's all new. If they get it wrong, if unforeseen exogenous things happen, it's a $1.5 trillion increase in deficits. So time is running out. We are looking at the fact that we squandered the opportunity in the last 5 years to do something about this. And in the future, it's that much more uncertain because monetary policy isn't going to be bailing us out like it used to be. That's my big concern. Let me ask you one point in relation to that about the driver of this. Figure 1.2 in your report, page 15 in your report. I think it's interesting. It compares where we were in 1974 to where we're going to be in 2024. We're on track to increase the deficit tenfold over the next decade compared to 74. Meanwhile, if you look at the upper right side of this, we will have cut defense in half. We're going to be collecting a full percentage point more of the economy in revenues. Given these facts, what is driving, just so people are clear, what is driving the tenfold increase in the deficit?
Is growth in spending for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, above all else, driven by both the aging of the population, by an expansion of health insurance subsidies, and by rising costs of health care per person.
Thank you. Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick comment on the Fed. As the Federal Reserve pointed out, the fact that Congress created a fiscal drag on the economy made things worse, and the Fed did take some accommodating actions. But their message to Congress was the sequester is doing harm, it's hurting economic growth, it's hurting job growth, and it continues to do so to this day, this refusal to take action on investments in infrastructure and in basic the foundations of our national economy in many areas. There's been a lot of talk about the report and what you've said about the Affordable Care Act. I just want to go through a couple things. You found, did you not, that the premiums offered in the exchange would actually be going down 15% compared to your earlier projection. Is that right?
Yes, for 2014.
Thank you. And on page 125, you point out that there's, quote, no compelling evidence that part-time employment has increased as a result of the Affordable Care Act. Is that right?
Yes, that's right, Congressman.
Thank you. And because we've heard a lot of statements about how people are being forced into part-time work by the Affordable Care Act, I want to make it clear one of the findings of CBO is there's no compelling evidence that that's the case. Second, there's nothing in this report that changes CBO's earlier assessment that over the 10-year window and, in fact, over the longer-term window, the net effects of the Affordable Care Act is actually to reduce our national deficits. Isn't that right?
That's right, Congressman.
All right. And doesn't reducing our national deficits, especially as the economy kicks into higher gear, mean stronger economic growth?
Yes, Congressman.
All right. So as a result of the deficit reduction impact of the Affordable Care Act, in 2017 and beyond, the Affordable Care Act will actually help spur economic growth. Now, I want to talk about what we're doing, focusing right now, because on page 125, the CBO talks about the impact on the labor market, on labor demand today. And it says, and I quote, on balance, the CBO estimates that the ACA will boost overall demand for goods and services over the next few years. And then you go on to say the net increase in demand for goods and services will in turn boost demand for labor over the next few years. That's a conclusion you make, right?
Yes, that's right.
So when you boost demand for labor in this kind of economy, you actually reduce the unemployment rate because those people who are looking for work can find more work, right?
Yes, that's right.
So I just, for all the media who, shot across the headlines this idea that somehow the Affordable Care Act was going to hurt jobs, I just want it to be very clear that the director of the Congressional Budget Office says for this year and the next couple of years, actually it will help reduce unemployment. More people who are looking for work will find work as a result of the Affordable Care Act. So in fact, Dr. Elmendorf, if you were to repeal the Affordable Care Act, your projected unemployment rate for this year would go up, right?
Well, so Mr. Congressman, let me be clear that so we've not broken down the sizes of the various pieces that we talk about in this act. So I don't have any estimates of the effects of the particular channel you point to. But that channel you point to is in fact something that we think spurs employment and would reduce unemployment over the next few years.
Right. Okay. So I think it is a factor, and as a result, if you repeal the Affordable Care Act, you will, at least in the near term, increase the unemployment rate because there will be less demand for jobs. And over the longer term, because the Affordable Care Act reduces the deficit, you will actually spur economic growth as the economy continues to recover. Now, I think it's really important that information gets out there because as the media themselves have confessed, they bought hook, line, and sinker some of the talking points from our Republican colleagues, and unfortunately misrepresentations go around the world 3 times before the truth begins to catch up, but maybe it will begin to catch up at this point. Now, in terms of the long-term deficits and debt, as the chairman indicated, as your report indicates, as you go out into the future, we will see rising deficits. It is important to point out that your findings show that right now our deficits are dropping and will continue to drop for the next couple of years. But as more baby boomers retire, and there are more people on Medicare and Social Security, spending will slowly go up. Isn't that right, Doctor?
That's right. There'll be more than 1/3 more people collecting Social Security and Medicare benefits a decade from now than are doing so today. Whatever the benefit is per person, multiply that amount by a much larger number of people, the overall cost of those programs will rise very sharply.
That's right. So I mean, we're talking tens of millions of people. I believe it's in the range of additional 30+ million more people on Medicare. And just so people who are following this understand, this is not because we're increasing the Medicare benefits. This is just more people coming into the system. This is a demographic change. Is that right, Dr. Elmendorf?
Yes, that's right.
And so that's a big driver. Now, our Republican colleagues say that those deficits concern them. However, they're only willing to look at the spending side of the equation, meaning if you want to address those spending problems, it means you've got to reduce the benefits from Social Security or Medicare somehow, if we're looking at those two pieces, right, Dr. Elmendorf?
Yes, unless one is willing to contract the rest of the government to below where it was as a share of the economy in 1940, then one needs to focus on this handful of large programs that are getting more expensive if one wants to cut spending. And
as you pointed out in this report, and it's been very clear, we have squeezed those so-called discretionary spending programs to the lowest point in recorded budget history. Is that right?
We'll have a few years from now after the current caps have unfolded.
So our Republican colleagues' solution is simply to look at squeezing those benefits, which help millions of Americans, including a lot of middle-income, struggling seniors. And they've refused to look at the revenue side of the equation. It is their position that you cannot close a single tax loophole for the purpose of reducing the deficit, right? That's the Grover Norquist pledge. You can't close one loophole in the taxes for the oil and gas company or hedge funds in order to help reduce the deficit. And my question, Dr. Elmendorf, is if you go back a little ways in history, when's the last time we actually had a balanced budget?
I think 2000 or 2001, Congressman.
2001. And in fact, the last time we had a balanced budget for a very long period of time were the years 1998, 1999, 2000, 2001. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And just so everyone understands, for decades before that, we were running deficits, and obviously since 2001, we've run deficits. Now, Dr. Elmendorf, if you look at the revenues as a percent of GDP during that period of time, they are higher in each of those years than they are today. Is that right?
Yes, that's right, Congressman.
And they're higher, are they not, in each of those years than they will be as a percent of the economy 10 years from now?
Yes, that's right.
In fact, my calculation is that the average amount of revenue as a percent of GDP, when we last balanced the budget, was 19% of GDP. During those 4 years, the average amount of revenue coming in was 19% of GDP. Now, you have just testified that the main reason that we're going to see an increase in the deficit in the out years is because we have tens of millions more Americans on programs like Social Security and Medicare, right?
Yes.
All right. So it's our Republican colleagues' position that we can somehow deal with that huge increase in the number of Americans on Social Security and Medicare with less revenue as a percent of GDP than we had when we last balanced the budget in 1998 to 2001, when we had a lot fewer Americans on Social Security and Medicare. And that is the problem, Mr. Chairman, a lot of our Democratic colleagues have. You take the position that you won't close a single tax break for the purpose of reducing the deficit. You say you care a lot about the deficit. You recognize that you've got tens of millions more Americans on Social Security and Medicare, but you still want the government to operate on less revenue as a percent of GDP than the last time we had a balanced budget when we didn't have all those tens of millions of Americans on Social Security and Medicare. So the only solution that our Republican colleagues are proposing, unless they want to cut even more deeply into our investments in defense and scientific research and infrastructure, is to simply cut those other programs. And the irony here is the Affordable Care Act actually was able to reduce the Medicare spending by reforming it instead of cutting it. As a result of the Affordable Care Act, Dr. Elmendorf, we are seeing reduced Medicare costs. Isn't that the case?
Yes, that's right.
In fact, that's a significant part of the reduction in the deficit over a period of time. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And in fact, our Republican colleagues, after initially, lambasting that and demagoguing that, they included that provision in their own budget so they would achieve those deficit savings. So we were actually able to achieve Medicare savings without hurting beneficiaries. And that is the model that we will continue to look at, and combined with closing tax breaks for special interests in order to meet these long-term challenges. But our immediate challenge is to put people back to work, and that's why we need to adopt our infrastructure investment plan, pass the minimum wage, and for the folks who are still out there hurting, we should extend emergency unemployment insurance, and we certainly, Mr. Chairman, should not mess around with whether or not we pay our bills on time. Thank you very much.
Dr. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Elmendorf, welcome to the committee once again. Appreciate the good work that CBO has done, and I think there are, my friend from Maryland says the report is good news and bad news, and I would agree with that. The problem is that when you compare it to last year's report and reports prior to that, there's more bad news this year than there was last year, and less good news this year. Our friend makes the comment about decreasing Medicare spending. Yeah, the spending in Medicare has decreased by $700 billion because of the Affordable Care Act, but it's forced reductions. And as a physician, I can tell you that my former medical colleagues will say that it actually is harming health care for seniors. And so the challenge that we have here is to put in place programs that don't harm seniors, and our friends on the other side seem to be willing to put in place programs that actually do harm seniors. Mr. Elmendorf, Dr. Elmendorf, what happens in a fiscal crisis to those benefits for seniors?
Well, it depends on the nature of the crisis and what the Congress does to respond to it. But the fiscal crisis, as we've used the term, as a point at which investors are unwilling to buy U.S. government debt unless it carries very high interest rates. And that then puts a tremendous squeeze on the rest of the government budget.
So the squeeze that might happen is that services to beneficiaries actually decrease significantly under a fiscal crisis. Is that not correct?
That could happen, Congressman.
And we haven't. Is it your estimation that Congress really hasn't done anything to address the challenges of a fiscal crisis in the last year?
Well, so as you know, the Congress has taken a number of steps, and I don't want to diminish those, but it is clear from our report that the fundamental fiscal challenge remains, which is significant increases in spending for certain programs. And even though all the rest of the government is on a track to become smaller relative to the size of the economy, we nonetheless show high and rising debt. And that means that the country will need to make choices it has not yet made about cutting back those large programs or raising tax revenue to pay for them.
Which is a great segue to the Medicare program. The Medicare trustees say that the Medicare program is going to go bankrupt by 2026. What does that mean to real people? It means that services that have been promised to seniors, there won't be the resources to be able to provide those services. So what our side, and I love how our friends on the other side of the aisle like to characterize our solutions. The fact of the matter is our solutions actually solve the problem. In fact, we've put forward multiple solutions for the mandatory programs. In the area of Medicare, we've talked about a premium support system. And I want to draw your attention, if I may, Dr. Elmendorf, to a report that CBO put out last September that modeled premium support systems. And it wasn't the specific one, but the question that I want to get the answer to is a premium support system may in fact be possible that, to quote the report, combined spending by both the federal government and beneficiaries, that is, premiums and out-of-pocket costs, would be less than if current law remained in place under a premium support system. Is that the conclusion that you all drew?
Yes, that's certainly the estimate we made for the system that we analyzed. As you know, there are many, many specifics that can affect the budgetary outcomes and the effect on beneficiaries an awful lot. So one should not take that as a statement about anything that would be labeled a premium support system. But that was the effect, by our estimates, of the system that we analyzed.
Therefore, a premium support model, that is something that saves Medicare for seniors, would decrease spending, potentially decrease spending for the federal government and decrease spending for beneficiaries. I think it's important that when folks are listening to solutions, that the solutions be explained by those individuals that actually promote the solutions, not those that criticize the solutions. In the short time that I have remaining, I want to touch on this issue of the interest rate question that the chairman got to. Again, as I say, I think this is more bad news than there was last year. And Table D1 that highlights the issue as it relates to interest rates. A percent increase, 1% increase in interest rates last year was projected to cost $1 trillion. This year, it's $1.5 trillion. What happened? What's the difference?
I believe, Congressman, this is mostly the effect of changes in our projection of the amount of debt. Jeff Holland is pointing out that the last time we issued this table was actually 2 years ago. We did a more abbreviated report last year because the Congress acted even later, and we were even under even tighter time constraints. So relative to 2 years ago, it is more expensive, and the reason for that is larger debt projections. But it's not from the extra $1 trillion of this year's upper revision from this year. It includes the revision last year, which was much larger. Remember, because our current law baseline before that had incorporated the expiration of the tax provision.
As the chairman said, time's running out. It's time to act.
Mr. Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Elmendorf, nice to see you. Thanks for your testimony. I want to dig a little deeper into the methodology that you use to assess the impact of the Affordable Care Act on hours worked. And the chairman, I think, was mentioning an example of a young person. At least that would be a shame if somebody couldn't find his or her way up the economic ladder, starting to work and so forth. My son is 30 years old and single. He found insurance through the Kentucky Exchange, pretty good coverage for him at $180 a month. So we're talking about $2,200 a year premium. If he got 100% premium support, subsidy, what in the world kind of incentive would he have to not work?
Well, by working, of course, he would earn income to spend on many other things. So health insurance is only one of the considerations that people have in mind.
It seems to me that there's an impression out there that that you talk about a disincentive to work as a part of the impact, and I'm just saying I'm trying to figure out the methodology because I can understand why a 62-year-old under the Affordable Care Act might say, I want to retire, and now I can retire because I can find coverage that I can afford, whether or not I get a taxpayer subsidy or not. I understand that example. I'm trying to figure out an example of somebody who is at the lower end, where there would actually be an incentive not to work.
So I guess so you're certainly right, Congressman, that some of these people would be early retirees, as you've described. A way we put the other part of it is that it's not so much an incentive not to work as less of an incentive to work. So under the law prior to the Affordable Care Act, if one decided to work or decided to work more hours, then one would earn higher cash wages and would maybe receive health insurance, but would give up some of those extra cash wages in the sense of paying some tax on them or losing some other benefits. By providing an additional benefit to people who have very low income, a significant one in the form of subsidized health insurance, then the increase in the standard of living that those people would have by working or working more hours would be smaller than it would be otherwise. They would still have a higher standard of living by working in almost all cases, but the standard of living wouldn't be as much higher relative to what they would have if they didn't work or if they worked fewer hours. So by providing a somewhat smaller incentive to work, somewhat fewer people would work.
All right. As I understand it, the subsidy was set up in a way that no one should have to pay more than about 9% of their income for health insurance. Could you give me, and I would accept it not on the spot, some kind of numerical example of someone who would have a disincentive to work because of the subsidy, whether it's 90% or 50% or whatever it is, because I'm having a hard time understanding how that could possibly make sense.
So we're happy to send you an example of that. Again, it's not they have no incentive to work, it's that they have a smaller incentive than they would have had otherwise.
Moving on, as we look at the long-term repercussions of deficits and projections and so forth, and the impact of entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, and so forth, have you done an analysis of what immigration reform would do to soften the impact of those expenditures, or I shouldn't prejudice you, to change the long-term impact of health care costs, of Social Security benefits, and also of economic benefit?
Yes, Congressman. So we did a very thorough analysis of the immigration bill that was passed by the Senate last year, and we found that legislation would reduce budget deficits and lead to a larger economy, and over time lead to higher output per person in this country.
And it does that because you would have a lot of younger people paying into Social Security and paying the Medicare tax, but not not receiving benefits for 30 years or 40 years. Isn't that kind of just the...
So I think that's part of it,
right?
Congressman. So it's the age matters. It's also the composition of the additional people who would be let into the country and given a chance to work under the Senate legislation. So a number of those people would, we think, receive some benefits, but a number would be high-skilled, high-educated people who would be paying a lot in taxes.
Great. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Mr. Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Elmendorf. If there's one good thing I hear from both sides in this morning, it's that no one is saying, oh, it's great that the deficit's increasing and that it's going to get to $1 trillion. So everyone is interested in reducing the deficit. That is a good thing. Let's talk for a second about taxes, that side of it. There were a bunch of tax increases in 2013. Those are reflected in this projection.
Yes.
Also, 2014, there's about 60 tax credits and deductions and so forth that expired. Have you included those in this as well?
No. So the provisions that have expired, as you know, we follow current law and the basic projections. But we do provide some alternative policy scenarios for your use, one of which extends all of the expiring tax.
Right, but in the summary table 1, you've assumed they expire.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. So what I'm getting at is that there were tax increases in 2013, there are tax increases in 2014, and I think there's even some in 2015 that are all reflected in this, which is why revenues go from 16.7% of GDP last year to somewhere between 18 and 18.4 starting next.
So I think there are two key factors. You have one of them, Congressman, which is the changes in tax provisions, and the other is the strengthening of the economy, which pulls in more revenues as a share of GDP.
Okay. So, but a number of tax increases from 2013, 2014 are included in this. So we've had tax increases. All right. Now you mentioned 4 things, and I'm going to try in probably 30 seconds on each one. And I'm not going to mention the order you did in your opening statement that you said are driving the deficit certainly from the spending side. One was interest on the debt. 2 reasons for that. Interest rates are not expected to stay at these historically low levels. But the other is that the deficit itself obviously feeds more debt, which feeds more interest. So
yes.
The best cure for that is to eliminate the deficit, correct?
I mean, all other considerations aside, Congressman, yes, a smaller deficit would lead to less interest payments.
Okay. Then you talked about the costs of medical care going up generally and how that's affecting the various medical programs, Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera. So you're still projecting that the costs of medical care are going to go up. I'm trying to balance that against the argument that Obamacare is reducing the cost curve on...
Well, Congressman, there's been a very pronounced slowdown in the rate of growth of health care costs per person in both federal programs and the private sector over the past half dozen years or more. And we have taken a significant lesson from that and have lowered our projections for the federal programs going forward. But we've not lowered them so much as to have no more growth left. That would be a really quite extraordinary turn of events. What role the Affordable Care Act has played in this slowing of health care costs is, I think, quite unclear to analysts at this point.
So you're basically saying that there are conditions out there before Obamacare, after, whatever, that increase health care costs, and you expect those conditions independent of government action to continue to some degree.
Exactly. Not at the rate we thought before, but at a positive rate.
Okay, that gets to a similar thing. You mentioned aging the population, which is obviously something that, guess what, we here in Congress, fortunately, cannot control. And so those 2 factors, cost of medical care and aging, are what is driving up the costs of so many of the major entitlement programs. So if we're going to get this deficit under control, we've got to do something about those, don't we?
Well, Congressman, I think you either need to cut back on some of those large programs or raise revenues to a larger share of GDP or some combination of those 2 policies.
Okay.
And it's
but
not
we just did raise revenues as a share of GDP.
To some extent, yes.
To some extent, yes. Okay. Then the last thing you mentioned was driving things was Obamacare. So that's driving things on the cost side. I understand there's tax increases that were involved with it, but it's driving a lot of additional cost as well.
Yes, the expansion of Medicaid and the institution of subsidies, these tax credits to be provided through exchanges, is part of what's pushing up federal health care spending.
And then won't the 2.5 million full-time equivalent job loss, whatever that is, 2 million, doesn't that retard revenues as well? Because that's people that aren't working, aren't making money, aren't paying taxes.
Yes, relative to not having those effects, that lowers tax revenue. Revenue is still rising, of course. I just mean that relative to what would have happened without that effect, that reduction in employment, reduction in GDP implies a reduction in tax revenue.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Pasquarello.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. Director Elmendorf, do you believe that when Social Security was passed, it had an impact on labor supply, since we are distinguishing between labor supply and demand? You
Yes, absolutely.
announced that very clearly. In a similar way that you would project Obamacare will have?
I mean, the specifics would be different, but the basic point is the same, Congressman, which is the provision of income to people over age 62 or 65 has allowed some of them to choose not to work who otherwise would have felt compelled to work.
I wonder if there was a headline back then in 1936 and 37 about what was going to happen to demand. If it were repealed, let me ask you this question, or if the benefits were cut due to privatization, an option, that would have an impact on labor supply, wouldn't it?
Yes, that's right.
How?
It would push up labor supply. In fact, we've done estimates of the effect of raising the eligibility age for Social Security. We think that would increase the amount of work that people do primarily in their 60s.
Particularly with seniors, more of them would work beyond what they could be working. Is that correct?
It would work longer than they would under current law.
The fact that Americans won't be tied to a job they don't want or need solely because it is the only way for them to get affordable health care is a feature of Obamacare, not a bug, as I look at it. Director Elmendorf, if your assumptions prove correct, and 2.3 million Americans remove themselves from the labor supply, what effect will that have on the unemployment rate and on wages?
So, Congressman, we think that people leaving the labor, choosing not to work because of the incentives provided by the Affordable Care Act would have essentially no effect on the unemployment rate. We said that very clearly in our report. The effect on wages is we did not analyze formally. It's complicated. Depends on how the capital investment responds to changes in work, and we have not tried to model that or estimate that specifically.
So what you're saying is that because of the security of Obamacare, that it provides a 60-year-old, let's take that as an example, might decide to retire early.
Yes.
And open up a job for someone who was unemployed today. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right, Congressman.
This is an example of the drop in the labor supply. Now, in fact, the CBO's report, you specifically state, the estimated reduction stems almost entirely from a net decline in the amount of labor that workers choose to supply, rather than from a net drop in businesses' demand for labor, quote unquote. I didn't see this in any of the announcements about this yesterday. I just wonder why. I'm very curious about that. You said it, I didn't. So in other words, this isn't employers cutting jobs. It's newly empowered workers choosing to go a different path.
Yes.
I think that's a good thing. Chairman Ryan, my good friend, you said in 2009 when we were debating Obamacare. You want to debate him? Why not? We want to address job lock. This is what you said. So the key question that ought to be addressed in any health care reform legislation is, are we going to continue job lock, or are we going to allow individuals more choice and probability and portability to fit the 21st century workforce, unquote? I agree with you 100%. I think the answer is yes. Giving workers more choice is not unique to Obamacare. Other federal programs have reduced the amount of labor that workers choose to supply, just like Social Security. Right, Mr. Chairman?
I will take the rest of your 39 seconds to respond.
Go right ahead.
A couple of points. Social Security, the purpose then was to help produce a system so that older workers could not be destitute and compete for younger workers for jobs. So it was sort of the opposite attempt, which was to bring younger workers into the workforce by providing the Social Security benefit back during those days. This is the opposite. This is saying younger workers, the very people we want to go into the workforce to work, are being disincentivized to do that. So it's sort of the opposite of what you're trying to suggest.
Can I take my time back just for a second?
I'll just since you invoked me, I'm going to do this.
All right. But don't shut me out then.
Job lock, in this case, is a subsidy that ends, and it's a cliff that traps. What we've always said is it should be structured differently so that you don't produce this kind of effect. So we have literally a very different idea on how to address this issue so that you always encourage a person to go into the workforce, so that you always encourage a person to work. And Obamacare is structured the opposite of what
Well, that's your opinion.
intended.
That's your opinion. I mean,
Well,
we're still going to have a demand,
but-
and we're still basically talking about older workers.
My point to my friends on the other side of the
And
aisle.
I'm glad what you've said, because now we can all agree
All right.
that
Reclaiming
it's
my
not
time.
a socialistic scheme.
Gentlemen's time's expired. The point I'm trying to
works.
say is,
Okay, we
if you
got
want to
something.
ask a Republican their position, ask a Republican. If you want to ask a Democrat their position, ask a Democrat. Don't ask one to give the position of the other, because you won't get the straight shot. Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much. Although I hate to interrupt that debate, it was actually pretty good. I may just yield my time back to both of you and let you continue. But a couple of specific questions. First, I want to thank you for the work. It is exceptionally helpful and I think very fair. I'll just say for the record, I'm exceptionally, and I think most of us are, disappointed. We've actually worked and made a little progress here in the last few years on the deficit. And I voted with my friends on the other side on the fiscal cliff deal. That generated revenue. I know, Mr. Chairman, you did as well. The budget agreement that you negotiated with Senator Murray also restrained, discretionary spending. That made a little bit more progress in the right direction, and some mandatory spending as well. We're actually spending $164 billion less in the discretionary budget than we were spending in the last year of the Bush administration, fiscal year 2008. So that's actually real progress by Congress. And yet when you look at this report, it really doesn't translate into long-term deficit reduction for the simple fact that we just simply haven't done enough on the entitlement front. Is that a fair statement?
I think the Congress hasn't done enough on entitlements and revenues in some combination. And again, it's not our place to say which side of the budget you should give more or less emphasis
Fair
to.
enough. Between the two, which have we done more on revenue or entitlements?
Well, that depends on how you view the extension of the expiring tax provisions a few years ago. So under the current law assumptions we'd worked on, relative to that, the extension of most of the expiring income tax cuts in the early 2000s produced a big cut in revenues and a big increase in the deficit. I recognize that's not the way that many of you had thought about the sort of starting point in your own minds, but it makes it hard for me to answer that question, Congressman.
I know. That's why I want you to answer it. Are we going to have a lot more revenue than we would have had had we retained all of the Bush tax cuts?
You'll have more revenue than you would have had, exactly, because some of those tax cuts were allowed to expire.
Roughly how much more over a decade?
I would have guessed $1 trillion or so, but I'm not sure that we...
Okay. Well, ballpark. If you want to correct it later, that's fine.
I think my ballpark has been agreed to, Congressman, but
okay.
we don't know.
Well, let me ask you this. Have we had $1 trillion worth of reforms in entitlement programs?
Well, the Affordable Care Act made substantial reductions in spending for Medicare, as you know. I have not tried to assess what that would look like over the same 10-year time period as is allowing some of those tax cuts to expire. So I think I should not speculate more about numbers I haven't looked up.
Well, let me come at it. I can look politically. It's obviously I think the revenue picture is easier to deal with, and the entitlement picture is easier to deal with. I don't care which side of the aisle you're on. That's just the case of it. We saw the struggle with entitlement spending, frankly, in the budget agreement between Chairman Ryan and Chairman Murray. That's just politically a very charged area. Let me ask you this. Of the entitlement programs, which are the largest contributors to the deficit going forward over the next decade?
Well, the largest program, the single largest program is Social Security, and the programs that are growing, whose increases are sharpest in dollar terms, are Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid.
And let me ask you this, and this is going to be a pox on both houses sort of thing. Has either party put forward a plan to deal with Social Security?
We have not analyzed any plans of that sort in the last few years.
I'd suggest that's because one hasn't been presented. We have not presented one on our side of the aisle, because it's politically pretty charged. Our friends in the administration hasn't presented one. It's probably statistically the easiest one to deal with because we actually know how many people turn the age. It's much more predictable, much easier, and yet neither party has had anything to say about it. Is that correct?
Well, we have provided Congress with a large menu of possible changes to Social Security and to other parts of the federal budget.
I'm not suggesting you haven't
not been asked to do a lot of estimates of specific pieces of legislation.
Actually, the last person who tried to lead in this area was President Bush, who actually did put forward proposals and did do something. And so I just say this for the record for my friends, because we're going to have a lot of, this is an area where I think we really ought to sit down. This is where we ought to go down. Our friend, Mr. Delaney, on your side of the aisle, has an interesting bill to deal with this by commission and make Congress vote up or down the same way we do in BRAC. I would suspect it'll be full of unpalatable choices for both sides of the aisle. But that's something I would like to see us begin to look at and do. It's the most important single program that we have, the most popular. It's the one most Americans want us to ensure, and yet neither side of the aisle has put a plan on the table. Yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Castor.
Well, thank you very much. And at the outset, I'd like to say, Chairman Ryan, I was listening to your opening remarks, and it was interesting because you kind of echoed some of the language of President Obama from the State of the Union address. You said you hope this is a call to action, and the President last week said this should be a year of action, so I hope this is a way we can come together to focus on
Yes, I implied action through Congress, though.
economic opportunity, economic growth. And there is some good news because we have made progress on job growth, but we have to do more. The economy now has added private sector jobs for 46 consecutive months, and a total of 8.2 million jobs have been added over that period. And this is reflected what I hear at home in Florida, where small businesses are doing better. It's been a very difficult climb from out of the Great Recession that kind of hit us earlier in housing in 2007, but here we are 2014, and businesses are hiring again. The economy looks better, except we have this intractable problem. It's kind of a jobs crisis, and the CBO report demonstrates that the outlook for job creation remains weak, and then we're dealing with the retirements of the baby boomers. That's why every time there's an announcement on jobs numbers every month, the unemployment rate is going down, but yet people are retiring and dropping out of the workforce. So we're going to have to be much more strategic in how government partners with business to create jobs, and that's why it was very concerning to me, the part of your report that highlighted Congress's eroding commitment to scientific research, education. You say now that kind of discretionary spending that has really that provides the jobs of the future it's going to be at its lowest level in 40 years. Could you expand upon that and take us through some of the areas, whether it's R&D, education, or tell us where that weakness is?
Yes, Congresswoman. So we wrote a report in the fall about the facts of federal investments and how the amount of federal investment has changed over time. And I think, roughly speaking, about half of non-defense discretionary spending can be viewed as an investment in physical capital, like highways or bridges, in human capital, economists call it, in the education and training of workers, and in research and development. And that non-defense discretionary spending will, under current law, under the caps, fall to a share of GDP that's lower than at any point in the 50 years for which the data on that sort of spending have been collected in that way. So now we don't know, the Congress doesn't know just how the money under those caps will be allocated to different activities. So we can't do a projection of research spending and research investment spending directly. But that sort of spending has remained about half of that total non-defense discretionary spending over time. And if that share is maintained in the future, then the federal government will be doing less investing relative to the size of the economy by the second half of this decade than it's done at any point in my lifetime.
So that's education?
Education it is investment in physical infrastructure like roads and highways. It is investment in research and development.
So that's the National Institutes of Health, NIH, National Cancer Institutes, medical research, scientific research?
They're all in that category, Congresswoman, yes.
And infrastructure and defense as well?
So in defense, discretionary spending is also on track to fall to a lower share of the economy than it's been at any point in the last 50 years. And again, how those cutbacks are allocated between the research done by the Defense Department and other things the Defense Department does is something that the Congress will need to decide in future appropriations bills.
So a lot of folks are relieved that the sequester has been replaced here in the short term for a couple of years, and you know, they tend to focus on the crisis that's right in front of them, but the challenge looking ahead in the next decade is going to be how we maintain these investments in what makes America great in education and research and development, medical research and infrastructure. And that's why I do think it's important for us to work together as we learn that the aging population is going to be a challenge, a fundamental budget challenge. And to my colleague, Mr. Cole, I would suggest, I would agree to work with you on this. There is, I don't think it's fair to say that the Democrats haven't been focused on Social Security. We're focused like a laser. I'd recommend Congressman Ted Deutsch's bill from Florida. And I would agree we need to work together to make sure that we are being strategic in the future on these budgets.
Mr. Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the work on this as well. Let me just bring a couple of things together we've talked about already. There's been some conversation about discretionary spending, obviously. There's been a lot of conversation about discretionary spending. Is it CBO's conclusion that there is no additional waste in government and that government is running as efficient as it can possibly run, and so there is no additional places in the discretionary area where we can deal with wasteful spending?
No, Congressman, that's not our view. And in fact, in our volume of budget options in the fall, we provided the Congress with dozens of options for cutting back on discretionary programs if you would choose to go that direction. But we also noted that I think the entire set of options we gave you would all be needed, and maybe more than that, in order to meet the caps that are already in place, because the caps are such that the current set of programs, there won't be enough money to continue the current set of programs and services under those caps. So even under current law, you and your colleagues would need to take advantage of a wide range of cutbacks in programs in order to meet the caps in future years.
Those cutbacks would be in programs and services. Those cutbacks be in reducing duplication and trying to deal with some of the inefficiencies and the inappropriate payments and all that.
Well, Congressman, that would depend on, I think, on what the Congress does and also on people's interpretation. My experience, programs that some members view as waste are programs other members view as important. And not my place to judge that.
I've noticed that as well, actually. Let me mention a couple of things on interest. Last year, once we got the 10-year window, we got to 2023, you estimated the interest payment alone at $857 billion. That interest payment now that you're estimating in 2023 is $819 billion. So we've actually made some quote-unquote gain at that point. But I'm also noticing as I look at the amount of interest that we pay versus the increase in the deficit each year, that number is strikingly similar many years. Now, some years the interest payment increase is higher than the deficit, and some years it's a little bit different. But if I track through just the increase and how much interest we're paying, it's very similar in numbers to actually the increase in our deficit every single year. So this seems to be a problem that is driven primarily right now, obviously there are other factors as well, by an increase in interest rates going up as well. Am I tracking that correctly? Let me just give you one, for instance. Yes. From 2017 to 2018, there's an increase in interest payments of $89 billion. At that same time, there's an increase in deficit spending of $74 billion. So if the interest rate wasn't accelerating, obviously we would make progress in our deficit, but we're not. It's increasing. If you go between 2018 to 2019, it's an increase of $76 billion in interest payments, but $97 billion in deficit spending. So it swings each direction. Can we talk a little bit about the interest?
Yes, Congressman. So you're right. If one wants to isolate the interest piece, that all the rest of government spending and revenues, the gap between them would actually be fairly stable in dollar terms over the coming decade. In that sense, one can attribute the rising deficits to rising interest payments.
So
of course,
what
it's possible to
do you
isolate other
estimate?
aspects of the budget as well.
But what do you estimate the rising interest payments? Why is that interest payment accelerating at this point?
So interest payments are rising, rising partly because of rising debt, but even more so because of rising interest rates. Interest rates, as you know, have been unusually low over the past half dozen years, and we expect, as financial markets expect, those rates to return to more typical levels. So interest rates on the 10-year Treasury note will be rising from 2% something to, we think, 5%. And that causes a very sharp rise in the interest payments the government will have to make.
To the point that 10 years from now, our interest-only payment is $880 billion.
Yes, in that last year, in the 10th year, 2024. Yes, Congressman.
So this concept of at some point getting to a primary balance, and we're just going to try to get to balance except for interest payments, we're basically saying we're going to try to get to balance except for around that last trillion.
Well, as you know, we're not specifying that goal. But yes, you're right. The interest payments will be very, very large.
I want to make a comment that's not related to this. It's related to CBO and the scoring and the structure. Each year when we go through budget negotiations and conversations, there is a scoring issue dealing with changes in mandatory programs, CHIMPs, where we take money from that is existing in a fund, move it to the next year's fund, count that as savings. Would you consider that? I know CBO officially considers that savings. Would you consider a change in mandatory program for an account to be an actual savings?
Yes, Congressman. We think that if you, in an appropriations bill, make a change in mandatory program so the government pays out less in that year, that is a real savings. You're right that the budgetary treatment here is very complicated, and these things can look, in the next year, we tend to focus on what you've done in appropriations and make the change in mandatory spending part of our mandatory spending projections. But I don't think we believe that there's anything that is fake about those changes in mandatory programs. If you really have made a change in law that cuts spending in that area, then that's what we're recording when we give you an estimate.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Ms. Lee.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, welcome and thank you so much for being here. Very useful testimony and hearing.
Thank you,
50 years ago, the war on poverty represented a dramatic shift in the federal government's priorities for helping those who were left behind in a growing economy. We hosted President and Lady Bird Johnson's daughter, Lyndon Johnson Robb, last month, and she reminded us that the major legislation that was passed during that time was bicameral, bipartisan, and with the leadership of the White House. And it has worked, even though we have a long way to go. Now, I want to thank the Chair, Congressman Ryan, Chairman Ryan, for at least beginning to engage in a debate around poverty. In the omnibus appropriations bill, the President signed into law January 17th. We were able to secure language, and I just want to read this to you, Mr. Elmendorf. It says, "Poverty is far too prevalent in the United States. Congress and the administration should work together to implement policies, interagency efforts, and support proven anti-poverty programs that reduce the existence of poverty and the suffering associated with it." So I wanted to ask you what policies or anti-poverty initiatives tend to get the most bang for our buck in terms of boosting economic growth. For example, what is the impact or the economic impact of not extending unemployment compensation for the 1.7 million people who have lost their checks while they're looking for a job? Will we see them fall into the ranks of the poor? Does raising the minimum wage boost economic growth and reduce poverty? What's the impact on poverty and economic growth rates as a result of, unfortunately now, the impact of structural and long-term unemployment as we continue to recover from the recession and can't seem to get any jobs passed? So I'd really like for you to respond to those issues around poverty, given the sense of Congress that was put into the omnibus bill.
Yes, Congresswoman. So we've estimated that if the Congress were to extend the additional unemployment insurance benefits that expired, that would add about a 0.25 percentage point to GDP growth in 2014 and would add a couple of 100,000 people to the ranks of the employed. And that we have not done an estimate of the poverty rate, but that would be good for people, some people who would otherwise be below the poverty line would end up above the poverty line because of those extra benefits. We've not tried to quantify that effect. On the minimum wage, we are currently doing an analysis of the effects of raising the minimum wage, both on the, in terms of the higher wages and incomes for people who keep their jobs and in terms of the people who would probably lose their jobs. And we hope to present that analysis to the Congress in just a few weeks. So I don't want to speculate at this point about the results of that analysis. On the long-term unemployed, you're exactly right that for many people who lose jobs and cannot find jobs again, the economic consequences for them can be devastating. And in fact, the consequences on their families and on their health and so on. And there's a substantial amount of research about this, and we reported on it a few years ago in a study for Congress. So many of them end up in terribly bad shape and end up below the poverty line. But again, we've not tried ourselves to quantify just how many more people that would be. But the persistent level of high unemployment, and we showed in our labor market report accompanying the outlook that the rate of long-term unemployment remains today, although it's come down from its peak a few years ago, remains higher today than it's been at any point before this last recession and weak recovery. And the economic and human costs of that are very, very large.
I'd like for you to look at the language in the bill, in the spending bill, and see if appropriate and if possible to give us some of your suggestions as it relates to Congress and the President, what we should do to implement the policies and interagency efforts and support anti-poverty proven programs. We'd like to hear your perspective on what we wrote into the law. Finally, I have a few more minutes.
Yes.
Let me ask you about the CBO report last year as it relates to the public option in the health care exchange. I think you said it would reduce the federal deficit by $158 billion through 2023, which reflects a $37 billion reduction in outlays and $121 billion increase in revenues. Now, with your new report, have you recalibrated that, or do we think that that still holds?
We've not re-estimated that, Congresswoman, but this estimate would still be quite applicable.
Thank you. Mr. Forrest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Director Elmendorf, thank you for joining us today. I'm sure that Americans, real-world Americans that are watching today's testimony, their eyes are glazing over. And so for them, I would summarize.
I'm offended, Congressman.
What's that?
I'm offended.
No, that's no offense to you. But I would like to summarize that, economics is essentially the mathematical expression of aggregate human and business behavior. And in that vein, I'd say that this latest CBO report, I think, is a better reflection of aggregate human employee and employer behavior over time as a result of government policy. Obamacare is one policy that has been enacted by the federal government. In addition to that, there were several other policies that have been enacted over the last 5 years that have affected our economy. In your report, you've talked about the impact of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, on the supply side of the equation in terms of what employees or prospective employees do. And you said that the equivalent of 2.3 million jobs would be lost due to because, let me rephrase that millions of hours would be of labor would be less would be offered, and expressed as job losses would be 2.3 million. So not to say that 2.3 million jobs would be lost. Have you looked at the demand side of the equation? The Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, has a huge impact on employers, and they are making economic decisions to determine how many employees they hire and what sort of hours that they ask these employees to work. Can you tell me in a short amount of time what impact that's had?
Yes, Congressman. So we looked and report in our outlook on the effects of the Affordable Care Act on the demand for labor. We highlighted two channels. One was the one that Congressman Van Hollen spoke about earlier, which is the effect on the overall demand for goods and services in the economy, and thus on employment. The other is the effects of the employer penalty on the demand for labor. In the very short run, for a given level of wages, requiring employers to pay some penalty amount for each of their employees in some circumstances amounts to raising the cost of those employees and would lead employers to reduce their number of people they hire. But we expect, as other analysts believe, that over time, costs that employers bear for their employees end up being borne by the employees in the form of lower wages. Health insurance costs are one example, and this mandate would be another. So we think that after a few years, the costs of the employer mandate are basically showing up in wages, and thus are affecting ultimately workers' supply of labor, but no longer the employer's demand for the most part.
Just to summarize that, you essentially took the potential negative impact on labor demand and translated it further into labor supply.
Yes, because the way we think wages will adjust.
Okay, I can live with that. I mean, I don't like the fact that we're hurting labor supply or labor demand, either one. I think that's bad policy, and that we as Republicans in the House are going to put forward our replacement alternative that doesn't do that, that encourages labor supply and labor demand. The CBO routinely analyzes administrative actions and tries to determine the impact on the economy. That process isn't terribly transparent at this point. But when you take Obamacare and EPA actions and Department of Labor actions and Fish and Wildlife actions, you go down through every agency, and they've issued tens of thousands of regulations over the last 5 years. What has been the impact? And I ask you from this frame of reference, as a person who has created or helped create hundreds of jobs in the real world, I know firsthand the impact of bad government policy. And I was wondering, do you have a cumulative number of potential jobs lost because of Obamacare and all the government policies that have been enacted in the last 5 years?
I'm sorry, Congressman, we do not. Our focus, as you know, is in estimating the effects of legislation that Congress is considering.
Okay.
We do have to go back and look at how laws are being administered in order to do our baseline projections, and that's part of why we looked at the Affordable Care Act again this time. But we don't do any sort of comprehensive analysis of the effects of regulatory policy.
I think that would be well served, because I mean, I think one of the reasons the labor force participation rate is so low is because employers have decided that they can't hire those types of employees where they stand, and so the employee base is given up, or prospective employee base is given up. I'd just say that the government policy that's happened in the last 5 years is expanding the poverty trap. It's pushing families out of the middle class and hurting their opportunities. I'll give back.
Sorry, gentleman's time has expired. Just want to keep us on the clock. Mr. Jeffries.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Director, for your testimony. I believe you testified last year that the imposition of sequestration would cost the economy potentially 750,000 jobs that would be lost. Is that correct?
That sounds right to me, Congressman. I don't remember specifically.
Okay. And there were estimates, I believe, by Standard & Poor's that the engineered, unnecessary, reckless government shutdown cost the economy about $24 billion in lost economic productivity, correct?
I've seen an estimate, but we have not done that estimate ourselves, Congressman. I can't vouch for it.
And I believe the CBO itself has said that as it relates to the failure to renew or extend unemployment compensation, that could cost the economy 200,000 jobs during this calendar year, correct?
Yes, that's right.
So there are choices that this Congress has made or will make moving forward that could adversely impact the economy, economic productivity, and job creation moving forward, correct?
Yes, Congressman.
Okay. Now, as it relates to the CBO discussion concerning the ACA, it's your estimate that the ACA will result in the decline of full-time equivalent employment, correct?
That's one of the ways we've measured the effects that we've analyzed, yes.
And just so that I understand it, this stems from a net decline in the amount of labor that workers would choose to supply.
Yes.
Correct? I believe you say that on page 117.
Exactly.
And so this estimate on the impact of the ACA's, or this estimate of the impact that the ACA would have on labor market participation, you yourself nonetheless go on to characterize is substantially uncertain, true?
Yes.
And the reason why it's substantially uncertain is because this is a new program, and the impact of its imposition and the effects of the program are unclear.
Yes,
correct?
that's right.
So notwithstanding all of the hysteria that has been created over the last 24 hours related to your estimate on the impact on labor participation, by your own estimation, it's not even clear that there will be an adverse impact moving forward, correct?
So, Congressman, we've not tried to quantify the uncertainty. In some cases, we give the Congress not only our best estimate, but a range of possibilities. That requires more analysis we had not really done in this case.
Okay, but on page 118 of your report, you state that the actual effects of the ACA on labor participation could differ notably from your estimates, true?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Now, it's my understanding that the CBO also concludes that the impact of the ACA on the supply, even assuming that your estimates prove to be true, will be small or negligible for most categories of workers. Is that also your position?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Now, just so that I understand it, and I believe this was pursued in an earlier line of inquiry, the reason why you estimate that the ACA could have an adverse impact on labor participation is because the ACA puts older workers in particular in a better position than they otherwise might have been at a certain stage in life. Is that true?
It puts a set of workers in a better position. Some of them are older workers and some are younger workers, and we have not tried to analyze this for different age cohorts separately.
And because it puts a set of workers in a better position, they might voluntarily decide not to participate in the labor market at numbers that they otherwise might have done, correct?
Exactly, Congressman.
Okay. Now, at the turn of the century, did the imposition of child labor laws reduce the impact on labor participation?
I think so, Congressman. I had never thought about that question.
Okay. And did the standardization of the 40-hour work week in America reduce labor participation in this country?
It reduced the number of hours, total number of hours worked, Congressman. I think yes.
Right. And would you also say that the successful assault, not complete, but the successful assault on sweatshops in America reduced participation in the labor market?
Yes, I think it probably has, Congressman.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Elmendorf. This is really interesting material, and getting my hands around it. Still a freshman congressman. I have some questions that probably I should know, but I just need clarification. Trying to add up these outlays in this figure 3.1, what percentage of total spending, what is the percentage of total spending, or excuse me, total spending as a percentage of GDP in 2024 based on your projections?
In 2024, we think the total government federal outlays will be 22.4% of GDP.
And how does that relate to the average over the last 30 years?
It's about 2 percentage points higher than the average for the last 40 years, which is the comparison period we tend to use.
2% higher. And looking at your revenues, I see that you're projecting that, you say that from 1974 until now, the average revenue is 17.4%, and that you're projecting that we'll be above that beginning next year and throughout the rest of the period.
Yes, that's right.
And at the end, it looks like it's going to be about, what is that, 18.5%?
Yes, I think that revenues will be about 1% of GDP above their historical average.
So at what point does it...
Roughly.
I know economists speculate about at what point revenue as a percentage of GDP is a drag on the economy. You know, if you collect too much, it begins to drag on the economy. What is that percentage, or do you know?
There's no tipping point that economists are aware of, Congressman. I also think that the amount, and in part because the effect depends an awful lot on how the tax code is structured. So it's not just the total amount of revenue that's raised, it is also, or even more so, the way the revenue is raised. And so this has to do with the nature of the tax code and the particular incentives and disincentives created by the provisions of the tax code.
So you don't know of any limit. It could be 50% of GDP and it would still be not a drag on the economy.
Well, there are No, I didn't say that. What I want to say is that there's no magic number. The higher the tax rates are, all else equal, the more that distorts people's behavior. And if you're taxing work and saving, then the more that will reduce the amount of work and saving, all else equal. Now, as you know, the amount of debt that we have, which depends on deficits, which depend on the gap between revenues and outlays, also affect economic growth over time. So you have to be careful about what else is equal in these calculations. But leaving aside so that when you have taxes of a certain level, the higher those tax rates are, the more that will tend to distort behavior. Also, the more revenue you might raise, which could reduce deficits and have beneficial effects. But in our analysis, we take on board the effects of higher tax rates on the economy, but there's no number you go beyond where it's a problem. It's a problem from zero, and it becomes an increasing problem as you work your way up.
All right. I don't have any more questions. Thank you.
Mr. Pocan.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Elmendorf. It's good to see you again. I'd just like to talk a little bit about the jobs portion of what you have here. First, just if I can briefly, I know it's repetitive, but I think it's important given being new. I got a chance to see the Washington misinformation machine in operation yesterday. I saw it from afar when we had death panels because of the Affordable Care Act, and now I get to see it up close around the 2.5 million jobs it was going to cost. It was somehow implied that there'd be a decreased demand for labor from businesses, that somehow people would be reducing the number of hours people are working, and that the economy would be worse off. And I'm reading your report. I just want to verify, just double check these things one more time. You said that workers will be leaving participation because they're going to be choosing to leave rather than businesses' demand for labor reducing, correct?
Yes, Congressman.
And then second, I think you said that in the report that there's no compelling evidence that part-time employment has increased because of the ACA.
Yes, Congressman.
And then finally, I think you also said that by allowing low-income households to redirect some of their funds that they would have spent on that care toward the purchase of other goods and services, they would increase overall demand, which would induce some employers to hire more workers or increase the hours of current employees during that period.
That would be the effect in that channel, yes, Congressman.
Okay. So I know we talked about it, but I just wanted to repeat it because I know what happens. Sometimes perception becomes reality rather than reality becoming reality, and I just wanted to emphasize those points.
Can I say, Congressman, the reason that we don't use the term lost jobs is because there's a critical difference between people who would like to work and can't find a job or have a job that is lost for reasons beyond their control, and people who choose not to work. If somebody comes up to you and says, well, the boss said I'm being laid off because we don't have enough business to pay me, that person feels bad about that. We sympathize with them for having lost their job. If somebody comes to you and says, I've decided to retire, or I've decided to stay home and to spend more time with my family, or I've decided to spend more time doing my hobby, they don't feel bad about it. They feel good about it, and we don't sympathize. We say congratulations, and we don't say they've lost their job. We say they've chosen to leave their job.
Yeah, thank you. In fact, because it was just inferred earlier that somehow if fewer people, you mentioned they'd be better off in your report, in your language, in presenting to us, and it was implied somehow that if fewer people had an opportunity to get in the middle class, you wouldn't be better off. But I would argue, part of it is you're saying people who are in an aging population, more people aren't participating. That's part of the statistics. So people like my mom who worked till she was 70 at a Taco Bell don't have to do that. But secondly, it could be someone on the lower end who now is working 2 part-time jobs instead of 3 part-time jobs. And what that means is instead they might be able to tuck their child in bed at night and read a bedtime story or go to an activity, which means they're better off. Right? And at least that's how it is in my part of Wisconsin.
Those are possible stories, yes.
So then let me ask a question about what we can do in your report about jobs, because as we were just talked about with Mr. Jeffries, the sequester was about 750,000 when it's in full force. I know we relieved some of the pressure this year, but we go back to putting a lot more of that on in 2015. We're going to lose jobs there. We're going to lose jobs because we're not extending unemployment extension. So while people want action by Congress rather than the President, the problem is this Congress isn't acting. We're not doing anything to help create those jobs. Therefore, someone has to do something about that. Let me just ask you this. What policies tend to get the biggest bang for your buck, I guess, in terms of boosting economic growth that we could be doing in the near term?
So So, Congressman, we've, a number of times now in the past half dozen years, we've given the Congress our estimate of a set of options for spurring the economy in the short term. And the fiscal policy options that are most effective are those that put money in the hands of people who are most likely to spend it. So increasing aid to the unemployed has been very high on the list in terms of the bang for the buck. So providing additional refundable tax credits to lower and middle income households, reducing payroll taxes. Those things are more effective in spurring growth in the short term under our current economic conditions than government spending increases or tax cuts focused on people who are likely to save rather than spend a larger part of the extra money they end up with.
Yeah, 'cause at some point, how much you make, you can only buy one sofa. You can't buy 100 sofas necessarily, correct? Is that the theory?
I think there are some big houses, Congressman, but yes, people tend to spend a smaller share.
And let me ask one more question around the economic unemployment benefits, because I brought someone to the State of the Union from my district who lost his benefits, has his house up for sale because they don't want to go into foreclosure. They're not even inviting friends over for dinner because they don't know if they can afford food. In the past, when we've extended these benefits with no strings attached, what's the unemployment often rate been in this country?
So I don't have the facts of that at hand, I'm afraid, Congressman. But as we noted, the unemployment rate in this country remains very high, and the rate of long-term unemployment is higher today than it's been at any point for decades. The whole decades we have this series for, except for the past few years. It's come down a little bit off its peak, but remains extraordinarily high. And the costs of that to the economy and the people involved are very, very high.
Thank you, Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Director. I had not planned on it, but I want to follow up on what Mr. Pocan said because I think it's important. I agree with all of your answers to his questions about what stimulates short-term growth. And, of course, we've done a lot of that. We did a $1 trillion stimulus package in the first year of the President's administration. We did a $1 trillion health care bill. And as I look at all of that effort that was supposed to produce short-term results, what I see from your report is that it virtually doubled the public debt held by the public. So we were so committed to short-term stimulus that we borrowed more as a percentage of GDP in about 5 years than we had in the previous history of the nation combined. And we can argue about whether that was a good idea or a bad idea, but we did that in an effort to create this short-term growth. When, in your projections, do we return that debt back to historically normal levels? Presumptively, if we're going to do these things to stimulate short-term growth, you have to pay the piper sometime. When, in your projections, do we end up returning the debt to historically normal levels?
So debt does not return to historically traditional shares of GDP at any point in the next 10 years, or as we showed in our long-term outlook last fall, at any point in the decades beyond that.
Well, again, I agree with what you said to Mr. Pocan, that we can do things in the short term that stimulate economic growth, but presumptively that's good for the economy. What you're saying is the things that we did so exacerbated our debt that not just in the 10-year window, but in even your longest term windows, we never return debt to historically normal levels. It is always at this abnormally high and perhaps dangerous level.
So let me add a bit of interpretation to this. The first thing to realize is that a large share of the increase in deficits and debt in the past half dozen years was not a thing that any of you did deliberately. It was the automatic stabilizers in the federal budget. And we quantify those as best we can in this outlook. So the biggest thing, I think, that raised deficits and debt was not the deliberate actions. It was just in a weak economy, tax revenues fall by a lot, spending rises to some extent automatically. So a large share of the increase in debt would have happened if Congress had taken no actions. Additionally, Congress took some actions that, by our estimates, substantially strengthened the economy and added output and added jobs during that period. But you're right that if that debt is never, the extra debt is never paid down, then for all of its good in the short term, it becomes a drag on the economy in the longer term.
A terrible long-term drag. Now, I regretted that when you and Mr. Van Hollen were having your discussion earlier, we talked about balanced budgets in the 90s and early 2000s, because what I think of as a cash flow surplus during those years, but the truth is Congress was borrowing from the Social Security Trust Fund money that was supposed to be dedicated elsewhere, and so it's hard to call that spending balance. I don't want to take issue with that. What I want to take issue with is the suggestion that tax rates were higher there, and that led to some prosperity. When I look at your 10-year window, I see income tax receipts as a percent of GDP rising to about 9.4%. And as I look back historically in the decade upon decade upon decade that your report covers, I can only find 1 year in the history of our nation that income tax revenues were higher than they are projected to be in this 10-year window. So we're going to have historically high income tax collections, but to say again, you're saying that debt is not going to return to normal levels, and in fact, debt's going to continue to rise nominally?
Yes, Congressman, I would just add that there's been some shift, as you know, in the distribution of taxes over time. So certain elements of the tax code, like the corporate income tax, has collected less in revenue in some periods and more in others, payroll taxes as well. And you're right, the individual income taxes are the part that we see rising most substantially over the next decade.
You have an incredibly difficult job, and I'm glad you have agreed to do it. You opened your statement with saying deficits had declined sharply and will decline more. Folks back home in my district are going to hear you when you say that, and they trust you when you say that, and of course that's absolutely factually accurate. What's not said is they are declining to a level that is still higher than the historically highest level they had ever been before this administration. And I just ask you as we work going forward, because I think it's something that we agree on collectively. When you've been at the extremes on either end, any sort of movement looks less extreme than where you were. But whether or not it's the responsible thing to begin to accept that as the new normal, or whether we have an obligation to continue to describe that as being damagingly high, I hope is a question that we can continue. Because again, when Dr. Elmendorf talks, people listen. I'm glad that they do, but those words matter.
Thank you. It's very, very flattering, Congressman. May I just say that we tend to focus on budgets components relative to the size of the economy as percentages of GDP, particularly doing comparisons over long time periods when prices and the population and the real size of the economy have changed a lot. So the deficits that we see for this year and next year are actually at or below the historical average share of GDP. Looking back over the last 40 years. What is outside of the historical average of the last 40 years is debt as a share of GDP, and I took pains to emphasize that point in my opening remarks as well.
Thank you. Mr. Cardenas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Elmendorf, for your report and your remarks. I have a question for you. Let me set up where I'm going here so that you can understand what my question is. Today, unemployed Americans continue to struggle seeking a job that will support their family and give them a chance to earn their share of their American dream. The American worker doesn't want a handout. I don't believe the American worker wants a handout. I think they want to work. They want to earn a paycheck, and I think we must come together to remove the barriers that promote full-time employment. While long-term unemployment is a national problem, it doesn't fall evenly across our United States. Huge disparities exist in unemployment rates from heavily impacted states and those with lower employment rates. How would the unemployment rate be impacted by providing long-term unemployed workers with a lump sum unemployment benefit to help cover moving costs so workers can move from one area of high unemployment and perhaps to an area of low unemployment rates in order to accept employment that would require them to move?
So Congress, I'm afraid we've not had an opportunity to analyze that proposal. It's a very interesting one and might well have beneficial effects. But we would need to sit down and spend some time trying to think that through for me to give you a very useful answer, I'm afraid.
But does the data bear out that in some areas of America today, a snapshot of it is that employment opportunities are much greater in certain regions or states, where in other states unemployment is higher, or other regions?
That's absolutely right. The labor market is very tight in some places and very poor in others. Historically, part of what has helped to bring the labor market back to a better place after previous downturns has been the mobility of people. And there's evidence that the mobility of Americans has actually declined over time, which may be an aggravating factor, but we just haven't tried to think through how a particular policy might be able to address that.
So you don't have any analysis that indicates that perhaps one of the factors is the lack of resources to make that move? I mean, the average person who's ever moved knows that it costs more to move across town or across to another state or another region than it would just to drive back and forth to work. I mean, there are impending factors, financial factors that say if I don't have first and last to get another rental place for my family or what have you, there are expenditures in the move.
Yes, that's certainly true, Congressman, and that logic sounds right to me. I'm just, analyzing economic policy is complicated. I try not to do it
on the fly,
just sitting here without the benefit of the expertise of my colleagues. So, but we're happy to spend some time thinking about that more carefully.
I think it would be helpful for us to look at that because, again, as you seem to agree that it's logical that perhaps that is a factor, but you probably would have to analyze it in order for you to dispense that here to us congressional members. But if, in fact, we figured out a way to help people mobilize from one region or one state, for example, to another one where they have a much higher likelihood of finding employment just because of the simple fact that they're looking for employees there and they have a much lower unemployment rate. If we figured out a way to do that, would that help the economy?
Yes, that would, Congressman.
Now that would help the economy. Is it just overly logical to assume that if somebody gets off of the unemployment rolls and into the tax-paying working role, that helps the economy?
Well, so it certainly helps the budget if we get people to jobs where they can earn money and they can then pay taxes on it. The one thing I would want to emphasize is, despite the differences across regions, as you understand, taking the country as a whole, there are significantly fewer jobs than there are people who want them. So moving people to where there are more jobs can help. But in any case, however effective that could be by itself, it won't solve the whole problem because the country just, right now, there's less demand for goods and services than we have the ability to produce them, and that's weakened the demand for workers by businesses across the country.
Sure. There's the bigger picture, but if I'm a parent who's trying to feed my family and I'm sick and tired of getting an unemployment check and I really want to work and have that dignity of work like many Americans, I believe, do, to that person, their bigger picture is their picture. Here I'm living in the city or county that I grew up in. I finally have the guts to go ahead and say, hey, I'm hearing where my cousin lives that they're hiring and I'm qualified for that job. All I got to be able to do is move my family over there and I can get that employment. To me, that's a big enough picture for us to concentrate on that kind of effort so that we can actually hopefully make policy that can improve that family one at a time.
Thank you, Mr. Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Elmendorf, I'm sure when you write your notes at the end of the year about fun things I did this year, this day doesn't make that list. But we do appreciate you being here.
And it's actually not true, Congressman. I appreciate the chance to come and talk about the analysis that my colleagues and I have been doing.
The chairman asked questions relating to this issue about 2 million equivalent lost jobs. And I think the best way that I could explain back, I just want to make sure I'm understanding it right, that the equivalent of 2 million full-time jobs are people that look at the benefits they're getting under Obamacare and say, look, it's better for me just to stay and not work because I get those benefits. Is that right?
To not work or to work fewer hours.
Okay.
Yes.
If we look at that in isolation, what effect does that have on total tax revenues to the federal government?
So reduction in employment, whether it is voluntary or not, and is in this case, or not, in either way, that will reduce all else equal, reduce the amount of income being earned in the country and thus reduce the amount of tax revenue being collected.
People working less, choosing not to work, means they're not paying taxes. Revenue's going down. I think I read the report. It estimates that there's about $1.2 trillion over the 10-year budget window that are used to subsidize the exchanges, and about $792 billion for Medicaid expansion. So roughly a total of $2 trillion over the 10 years to pay for exchange subsidies and Medicaid expansion under Obamacare. Is that right?
Yes. We call that the gross cost of the coverage provisions, taking account of some of the other effects on tax revenues and so on. We end up with a net cost of the coverage provisions of $1.5 trillion over the next decade.
All right, so we're spending $2 trillion more. We're taking in less revenues because people are choosing to work less or to stay home. Looks to me like that's adding to the problem of our debt. Is that right?
Well, again, Congressman, when we evaluate the Affordable Care Act as a whole, including not just the coverage provisions that you've been referencing, but also the explicit cuts in Medicare payments and the cuts in, and increases in tax revenue, last time we did the analysis of the law as a whole, we found that it would reduce budget deficits. But you're right, this piece of the law, the piece that expands the subsidies for insurance coverage, costs the federal government money on balance.
All right, now Obamacare also includes a bailout for insurance companies in case things go bad, the risk corridors. Since enrollment started in the fall, it looks like we've had fewer people that actually enrolled in Obamacare than what we thought they were going to. How is this? Have you looked at the fact that insurance companies call this adverse selection, that it's the sicker people, those that are going to need more expensive coverage, that are actually getting in? What's that going to do to the subsidies for insurance companies?
Well, Congressman, by our estimates, the risk corridor program in the Affordable Care Act will actually reduce government deficits. It will lead to net savings to the federal government because it is a program in which if insurers' costs significantly exceed their expectations, the federal government is on the hook for some of that, but if insurers' costs fall short of their expectations, then the government can share in those savings. And the closest analog that we're aware of is a risk corridor program in Medicare Part D, the drug benefit, which has in fact yielded savings for the federal government consistently. Our estimate is that the risk corridor program in the Affordable Care Act will also yield savings, although we noted in our report that that is a very uncertain estimate. Our original projections for the Affordable Care Act take account exactly of the adverse selection that you're talking about. We thought that enrollment this year would be about a third of what it would be a few years from now, as people gradually learned about the program. And we thought that the people who would enroll this year would be sicker on average than the people who would enroll over time. And we presume that insurance companies understood that as well and incorporated that understanding into their setting of premiums. Neither we nor the insurers know now how many people they will end up with for this year or how sick or healthy they will be. So that's why their estimates in setting premiums and our estimates now are highly uncertain.
All right, one final question. I think the report indicates that over the 10-year window we anticipate the unemployment rate to actually go down, which in my mind is a good thing.
Yes.
But it says labor participation is also going to decrease. So how is it we have fewer people working and unemployment going down?
We think that employment will rise. Somebody probably put these pieces together. The participation rate is the share of the total population over age 16 that is working. We think that share will decline, primarily because a lot of people who are in their 50s and 60s now will be moving into their 60s and 70s, where participation rates are much lower. So most of that is just the aging of the population. Of the people who choose to participate in the labor force, we think a slightly smaller share over time will not be able to find work. They're the unemployed. But the rest, a growing share, will be able to find work. So we think employment will rise over the next decade, but not as fast as it would if we didn't have this aging of the population underway at the same time.
Thank you. Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate Mr. Nunley's line of inquiry because I think it's very important. What I heard you say is that risk corridors, which we borrowed from the Republicans when they did the prescription Medicare drug program. There were risk corridors in there, were there not?
Yes.
And you just said that helped save money over the long haul. And that in your estimation and that of your crack team of analysts, it will save money over the long haul under the Affordable Care Act.
I would say it's only a 3-year program, as you understand. So we think over the 3 years it is in place.
Unlike the Medicare prescription drug program that didn't have a time limit, this is just 3 years. But if it were eliminated, it adds to volatility and probably will cost money.
So if it's eliminated, that can...
already answered. I just wanted to repeat that because I really appreciate my friend bringing that out. And I appreciate him digging in with you the difference between jobs and workers. The unemployment rate is very likely to go down, even though there are people leaving the workforce, because we're not going to put a gun at their head and force them to work past retirement age, or if for some reason they're not tethered to a job because of their fear of losing their insurance, people might have more choices. So there's less participation for whatever reason, but not less jobs. I appreciate that clarification. I don't know if you have had a chance for your team to look at an analysis from the Urban Institute and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that found that 1.5 million Americans might start new businesses because of the freedom under the Affordable Care Act. Have you folks looked at that report?
I think my colleagues have, Congressman, but I have not had a chance myself, and we have not had a time to talk about it.
Well, I thought it interesting that here's an opportunity to actually increase employment, and it would appreciate at some point getting some feedback whether the folks at Robert Wood Johnson and the Urban Institute were off in the ozone, or if, as is usually the case, it's pretty good analysis. It would be very valuable to hear that from you experts if you've had a chance to look at it. I wanted to just focus for a moment on this notion. My friend Mr. Woodall talked about tax levels being high, higher than, and that if I understood him correctly, that we really haven't seen this era of really high deficits that we've in our history, such as we've experienced and may be looking at in the future. My understanding, I'm just looking here at the chart that you provided that shows that the long-term average for revenues was 17.4%. You think that that's going to go up to 18.1% going forward as a percentage of GDP. But on the same chart, on the page 6 of the document that was provided to us, it shows back when we were actually in surplus, the revenues were higher than 19.1%. And I think my friend Mr. Van Hollen alluded to that in his opening statement. We have seen revenues that were higher back when we were producing surpluses, and we have seen deficits that were much higher back when we were struggling with a depression and World War II, and we get these things into balance. I hope this is a day you look forward to, because I like watching you walk the tightrope, refer back to the data, encourage us to do so, and not take top-line focus group points, but look at what it actually says. And I think what you've done here in your testimony was pointing out the difference between jobs and workers, and loss of workforce participation is not necessarily bad, and that risk corridors are not some foreign concept that's going to cost us money that we can steal as part of a budget debt ceiling notion, and that the revenues that we've enjoyed over time when we were in surplus are actually higher than the...
Sorry. Mr. Williams. Keeping it
I was
tight.
just going to take one of Mr. Nunley's seconds as he went on, as you noted.
I cut him off as well. No,
You didn't cut
I
him
don't
off.
cut off Director Elmendorf. I cut off members.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank you.
You bet. You got it.
I'll be more strategic.
All right. Yeah. Now you get the drill.
Thank you.
Such a slow learner. Such a slow learner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Doctor, for your testimony. Appreciate it. I'm a small business owner for 42 years, family-owned business, and I like to think, frankly, like a taxpayer and a small business owner rather than a politician. The economy and the Main Street economy is not fixed. It's hurting, I can tell you that. And 0% hasn't worked, and stimulus money has not worked. The effects are evident from high unemployment to high underemployment, people living paycheck to paycheck, people on food stamps, and frankly, larger deficits. We see that. I believe the last thing we have to fix this economy and turn it around is through small business owners and lower taxes. I mean, I think that's what we have left. And I'm a big supporter of cutting the corporate, cutting the personal, cutting the cap gains, cutting the dividends, cutting the payroll tax, employee-employer, accelerated depreciation on fixed assets, and repatriation, and also inheritance tax. I believe there's places there that really, if we reduce all that, small business generates a lot of opportunity to to do the great things, make money, and frankly, small business doesn't save money. They spend money. They spend money on infrastructure and hire people, and I think that's a big answer to a lot of the problems that we have. With that being said, my question to you would be, what benefits would we be reaped by reforming our broken tax code, by lowering taxes and tax rates and broadening the tax base on an individual and corporate basis, which is revenue neutral, as I've indicated?
So, Congressman, we and other analysts think that the sort of tax reform you've described could boost economic growth, but the amount of that boost depends very importantly on the specifics of the tax reform that the Congress will consider, and we are standing by to do an economic analysis of approaches to tax reform if you and others on this committee would be interested.
Well, if you do these things, I'm convinced that you will just put more people in the job market, more taxpayers, more cash flow. It works. We talked a lot about minimum wage today, off and on. My question to you would be, to someone that owns a business, we raise the minimum wage. How do I pay for that?
Well, Congressman, as I mentioned in response to an earlier question, we are currently doing analysis of the effects of raising the minimum wage, looking at the effects on employment and the effects on family income, and we hope to present that analysis to the Congress in a few weeks. I don't want to get ahead of that.
It could cost jobs, and it could raise prices, and again, affect the consumer.
Yes, Congressman.
Next question would be, we're talking about tax decreases. What would be the effects on the economy of increasing marginal tax rates?
We think that, again, I think it's a widespread view among analysts that increasing marginal tax rates would slow the economy, all else equal. And the question is, but I want to emphasize, we have significant deficits. We think growing deficits. We have a high level of debt that weighs on the economy. So unless some change is made to either spending or revenues of a sizable nature, that high level of debt will weigh on the economy. So as you think about marginal tax rates and think about changes in spending programs, I think it's important for you and your colleagues to think about the direct effects of those changes, but also to think about the effects on the overall budget balance and thus on the debt and the economic effects of debt on the economy.
Well, I agree, and also I think as a retailer, you know, when you're not selling your product, or i.e. your widget, you don't raise the price, you cut the price to get more people buying, more people in the system, and I kind of think that's where we are. I appreciate your testimony, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. McDermott.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that we enter into the record the Washington Post article from 4 February that says, entitled, "No, CBO did not say Obamacare will kill 2 million jobs."
Without objection.
I enter that in the record because as I sit here and listen to this, I've been here 2 hours, I had to think of that aphorism that figures never lie, but sometimes people with an agenda can misinterpret the facts. I spent all yesterday morning sitting in the Ways and Means Committee going through this very same thing. Obamacare is causing a decline in jobs, I heard over and over again, and we're hearing the same thing today. We aren't blaming private companies for cutting hours on their own volition at the feet of the ACA, because somehow it's unreasonable to expect million-dollar or billion-dollar corporations to provide health insurance for their people who work slightly less than 40 hours a week. Now, if anybody bothered to read Mr. Elmendorf's report all the way to the end, and you've heard Mr. Jeffries and others talk about it, but I want to point it out again, they would read the conclusion in Appendix C about the labor market is subject to, quote, these are Mr. Elmendorf's words, substantial uncertainty. And they would find this quote even more, quote, in CBO's judgment, there is no compelling evidence that part-time employment has increased as a result of the ACA. So all this disaster put out on the airwaves is simply fear-mongering. This speculating about a disaster without evidence and before the reforms are fully implemented That's a strategy, a political strategy for the campaign. It goes nicely with the classic deficit boogeyman that we've been hearing about for 3.5 years. The Affordable Care Act isn't going to kill any more jobs than our deficit is threatening our economy. Our economy is coming back. But I still hear the boogeyman waved around, oh, God, the deficit, the deficit, the deficit. Bad math and paranoid speculation might make it seem so, but the facts don't add it up. If you read that article in the Washington Post, it's their facts checker who looks at the facts and comes up with the fact that what's being said and with all the headlines in the country is simply not what the report says. What's hurting us is the persistent notion that as our economy is gasping for breath, we believe we should tighten our belt and ration our air. The only way we'll ever get these numbers to improve is by investing. From education to research to development, America's resources, we have the knowledge, the ability, and the exceptional people to build the economy back up, but we won't do it on scraps. Now, this is a Congress that in the House of Representatives, we have let the R&D tax credit expire. We have not passed a transportation bill. We are going to come up to the summer season, and there isn't going to be any money in the states to build roads and bridges and all the infrastructure. We've cut research to our universities. And it's in that venue that we say, well, the ACA is killing all the jobs. We can't do it without training and loans, without investing in our social programs. And, Mr. Elmendorf, my view is that if you have any kind of subsidy, you're going to have some disincentive to work. We're at 400%, but the Senate's talking about 300%. They'd have a disincentive to work as well, right?
Yes, Congressman. This problem is intrinsic in any program that provides benefits to people who don't have much earnings in the labor market. And the amount of the effect on people's decisions to work, or how much to work, depends on the size of the benefit and to some extent on the structure of the program. But the basic issue here is the same for any program that would try to provide benefits to people.
Let me put you to the far end of that then. If we had a universal system, as the oncologists are saying, they're saying we need a universal system that covers everybody. If we had that kind of system, no one would go to work, right?
No, that's not true, Congressman.
Oh, the Finns go to work, and the Swedes go to work, and everybody else goes to work, right?
Thank you.
Yes, Congressman.
Ms. Black.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Elmendorf, so good to see you here today. I want to go to a topic that has not been talked about, because we have talked about our deficit and the growing deficit and where we might be in the future if we don't address that. But Social Security Disability Trust Fund is a real problem for us. And just to go back and look at the background so we can put some context in this, since 1970, the real inflation-adjusted disability insurance expenditures have risen from $18 billion to $140 billion in 2013. Now, a portion of this increase is due to two things, and we have heard that through testimony before: the aging population, which we all know, and then also the entrance of women into the workforce. We've heard that. But if you look at these two factors, they really only account for 6% on the aging side and 17% increase on the entrance of women for these increase in disability insurance caseloads. So at the same time, individuals are self-reporting an increase in their health, that it's improving. And so we see approximately 20 people per 1,000 have received DI benefits in 1970, as compared to now about 80 people per 1,000 today. So the latest projection from your CBO estimate is that Social Security Disability Insurance will go bankrupt in 2018. So by the end of 2017, no more dollars. 2018, we're bankrupt. Notwithstanding the aging population and the women entering the workforce, can you tell me why the spending has grown so rapidly in this program?
Yes, Congresswoman. I don't have the specific numbers at hand, but as you know, we've written 2 reports for the Congress on disability insurance, trying to document and explain the sources of growth and to offer you and your colleagues some specific alternatives. for changing the disability insurance program if you would like to go that route. In addition to the factors that you mentioned, the aging of the population and the rising participation of women in the labor force, and thus making them eligible then for disability insurance benefits if they become disabled, there have also been important changes in the rules for entering the disability insurance program legislated by the Congress over the past few decades that have pushed up the number of people receiving DI benefits. And the state of the economy matters as well. And as we wrote in our report, one thing that's happened in the past several years, as people have lost jobs and not been able to find new jobs, is those people who have disabilities, who might otherwise be able to find a job that could accommodate their disabilities, have instead, in some cases, chosen to enter the disability insurance program. So there's a wide array of factors, but I don't have at hand the relative importance of those factors.
And I'm going to certainly get with you and make sure that I'm reading those reports, because I've read a lot of reports, and I want to be sure that I've read the reports that you're referencing there. But what happens when this goes bankrupt? What happens how will this affect the beneficiaries?
Well, Congresswoman, if the trust fund runs out of money, then we think that there will be no legal authority to pay benefits until more money comes in. Now, as you know, the last time that the Disability Insurance Trust Fund was on the cusp of this problem, the Congress shifted money from the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund into the Disability Insurance Trust Fund and avoided that outcome. But if nothing were done, then I believe that the legal authority only exists to pay money that is in the trust fund, and that would require then a substantial reduction in benefits to fall down to the level of the ongoing incoming receipts.
So, pardon me for interrupting you, but there would have to be legislative action in order for those that are the recipients to actually gain the benefits.
Yes, Congresswoman, and again, we think this would happen in 2017. That the trust fund would run out of money to pay the benefits promised under current law.
In your reports, do you reference the consequences of the rampant fraud that we're seeing in the abuse in the program?
So we do talk about that, Congresswoman, and I think the issue for the Congress is trying to find the policy levers to change that, and I think there are some, and we do talk about them in our reports.
Well, I appreciate that. And then my final question is, what effect of the reduced labor force participation will it have on the economy?
It is the central factor in slowing economic growth after we get out of this current downturn. But later in this decade and beyond, the principal reason why we think the economic growth will be less than it was for most of my lifetime will be a slower rate of growth of the labor force.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Ms. Lujan-Grisham.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And I, like both my colleagues, appreciate your efforts and the work that you do, because there isn't, I don't think, a single member of this committee or anybody in Congress who isn't concerned about making sure that the economy is growing and that we're providing every kind of policy support that increases job growth in any context, particularly in a state like mine, where we actually have negative population growth and really struggling for economic growth, because we have a much higher than national average on federal investments, but it's largely related to intellectual investments and defense and the laboratories. But we have not really figured out that segue to stabilize the economy. So I'm very interested in the comments on both sides of the aisle in this committee today about what we ought to be doing to make sure that we are focusing on as many policies to give us as many opportunities to grow the economy as possible. And I know we've talked about unemployment, and I appreciate that. I want to talk about two more. One is, of course, increasing the minimum wage. And some of my colleagues are going to argue that I think that the minimum wage earners are mostly teenagers entering the workforce for the first time. And we're going to argue that that's really a drag then, increasing the minimum wage on the economy. Now, you might suspect that I disagree with that statement. Now, the average age of a minimum wage worker is 35. These are adults who bring a significant portion of their family's income, and a majority of these are women. Nearly 2/3 of the minimum wage workers are women. So while we have you here, I'd like to get more information on that second point and really hone on the impact that the increase in the minimum wage would have on the economy.
Well, Congresswoman, you're certainly right that minimum wage workers span the age distribution. Some are teenagers, but many, many are not. We are currently trying to complete a report on the effects of increasing the minimum wage on the economy, taking account both of the increases in wages and income for many people and also of what we expect would be employment loss for some people. And we hope to finish that report and release it within a few weeks. And I don't want to rather not offer my sense of that until the analysis is completed. But we do want to put this before the Congress in time for it to be useful information for you and your colleagues as you consider this legislation.
Well, I appreciate that because the studies and reports that certainly I have read indicate that it has a positive impact on both wages, earnings, spending, and therefore jobs, and certainly impacts women's. And in my state, where you have so many women as the single heads of household, that's going to be a significant impact on our economy, as does comprehensive immigration reform has a significant impact on the economy, not only in New Mexico, but on the entire country. Can you estimate for me the impact passing immigration reform has on the GDP over the next decade?
So as you know, Congresswoman, we did a very thorough analysis of the legislation that was passed by the Senate to increase immigration, and we thought that legislation would reduce the budget deficit in this decade and the following decade. We thought it would increase the size of the economy, it would increase overall GDP, and also not right away, but over time would increase GDP per person in the country. But I should emphasize that that analysis was specific to that piece of legislation. Alternative sorts of changes in our immigration policy might lead to rather different effects. But that piece of legislation would, as I said, increase the size of the economy and reduce the budget deficit.
And I'm going to just give those figures using the Senate's bill, but we're looking at the impact on the GDP over the decade is $832 billion, and the impact on the deficit over the next 2 decades is about $850 billion to the positive. Does that sound about right?
I'll take your word for it, Congresswoman. I just don't have those numbers right in front of me.
Well, I appreciate that. The point being, again, that we increase wages, we increase jobs, we increase opportunity, we stabilize the economy, which, on the other side, I'm interested in all of the impacts on health care, and the acute care and primary care system, in my opinion, with the Affordable Care Act and future changes are easy. It's the long-term spending on Medicare and Medicaid, and I include long-term care on the skilled care and home health care and hospice benefits and last days dying in hospitals. This gives us the opportunity to be thoughtful about those decisions going forward and really making a much more balanced decision for the economy.
Mr. Rokita.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank the Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Elmendorf, thanks for coming again. I always appreciate it. Always very instructive. Picking up on where my colleague left off, contrary to her assumption or assertion, I want people, and my party wants people, to live the best possible lives and build it for themselves that they can, whether or not they vote for us. I mean, that's what America has always been about. I am for young people having their first job. I am for women actively being part of the workforce. We are for all that. We are not saying no, but we're just saying there's a better way. So in light of that, as you're completing your study, can you tell me if you're going to contemplate any alternatives to the meat-handed approach of just raising the federal minimum wage across all sectors? I mean, are you going to look at the effects of an earned income tax credit? Are you going to look at the effects of maybe a subsidy in terms of a payroll tax deduction on the employee side of things or anything like that?
Congressman, this report will focus on the effects of raising the minimum wage. We will note that other approaches have been discussed in the past as alternative ways of boosting the after-tax income of low-income people. And as you know, CBO's done analysis of some of those alternatives in the past.
Yeah, thank you. So I just came from an Education Workforce Committee hearing where we were talking about early childhood education. And that hearing, combined with remarks that I've heard so far
then reminded me of the President's State of the Union address, where he, again, demanded across the board federal minimum wage as if there wouldn't be any effects to that, like humans being replaced by machines or a decline in employment by businesses. And I'm thinking about the hearing and thinking about in his speech in the same time that he was calling for a Head Start increase, which is an early childhood education program. So if the federal minimum wage that he's calling for applied to programs that he's also calling for, like Head Start, that would increase it seems to me, the administrative costs of Head Start programs, thereby reducing the number of slots for kids who deserve and need programs like Head Start.
I see your point, Congressman. We would not analyze that carefully. We'll tell you all that we think we've been able to figure out in the time we've been working on this problem.
Are you going to pick particular programs as examples of your analysis?
We're not quite finished, and I'd rather not be specific about exactly what we're doing. But we will try to talk about we do intend to talk about how these change in the minimum wage would interact with with parts of the government budget. But exactly what we will say, how specific we will be about certain things, we have not.
Right.
We're just not done yet.
So, because I was in the other hearing, I didn't hear the beginning of your testimony or your questions. But did you discuss at all in any depth the MyRA program?
No, that issue was not.
So let me go down that road a bit. The President recently proposed in the same speech, quote, MyRA, unquote, program, which would allow all Americans who qualify to invest in a U.S. debt instrument similar to what is available to federal employees through our thrift savings plan.
Right.
It's called the G Fund. Now, the G Fund is a fund available to federal employees. It's non-marketable. And the best way I can describe it is that it provides a subsidized interest rate over the long term for what is really a short-term security. If we apply something similar or the G Fund product to the entire American population or some subset of it, wouldn't that increase our borrowing costs as a government?
Congressman, I don't know. We don't, as a matter of course, analyze the effects of particular administrative actions, because as you know, our role is to provide analysis of legislation that Congress is considering. However, we do follow administrative actions because we need to understand them when we are updating our baseline. So if this particular change is one that we conclude ultimately would have important effects on the budget, then you will see that come through in our next baseline projection. But I don't know at this point if we've really had any time to stop and look at that.
Thank you. And then just generally in the 20 seconds I have remaining, talking about this deficit versus debt, I hope we all understand the difference between deficit and debt by this point. I mean, the debt is not going down, right? The debt is increasing.
Right.
Right. Is it better to encourage people to work in order to reduce the deficit, or to encourage people not to work in order to reduce the government's deficit?
Well, if the encouragement could be done at no cost to the budget itself, then, let me rephrase a bit, the more people who work, all else equal, the larger our output and income and the larger tax revenue and the smaller the deficit.
Thank you. Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Chairman Ryan. Started with the Ryan, we're going to end with the Ryan. So the report said, it did not say that Obamacare would get rid of or cost 2 million jobs, correct?
Correct.
It said that the Affordable Care Act will cost the equivalent of 2 million jobs. And that means hours, correct? So there'll be a reduction in hours?
So we've tried to frame this as reduction in total hours worked. But I also want to be careful about the use of the word cost, Congressman. Again, we're trying to draw a very important distinction between changes in people's work that is forced upon them by their employer saying, we can't afford to pay you to work, or we can't afford to pay you to work as many hours, and choices that individual workers will make to reduce their hours.
So these are choices that workers will make to say,
the effects we estimate are almost entirely
because
choices.
of the coverage I have, I can now choose to reduce hours.
The effects we estimate are almost entirely choices by people.
Of that group, who's the largest group that you would classify of people who will make that choice?
So there are a number of channels through which the Affordable Care Act reduces the incentive to work and thus we think will reduce work hours. Some of those are through the subsidies for particularly through the subsidies for lower income people. But there are also some effects of the higher tax rates on some higher income people.
So who would this be? This would be spouses?
So these...
You see that as a group of...
Yes, I think a number of groups of people could be affected in that sense. We've not tried to break this down. So it can be spouses, but it can be primary earners who decide to scale back their hours. They may not leave the workforce altogether. It can be some older people who decide to retire earlier than they would have been able to otherwise. It also could include younger people.
So we're talking about a situation where there's a husband and wife, and they're both working, and they have a baby, and one of them decides to not work or reduce their hours in order to stay home with the baby. They would fall into this category.
Yes, Congressman.
So a steel worker in Youngstown who worked from 18 years old to 58 or 60 years old, retired, now has a little part-time job, low-wage job, in order to pay for their health care. If they stop working, because now they will have access to health care, that steel worker would fall into this category.
Yes, Congressman.
Right? In your analysis of this, do you account for anyone who is going from, say, working 3 jobs to go down to work 2 jobs? Is that
something like that would fall into this analysis as well? We have not tried to break this down.
You haven't broken it out. So someone who has done that, because I remember George Bush was president, and someone said, Mr. President, I'm having a really rough time working. I have 3 jobs. And he said, that's great. And what we're saying is we want to try to make it a little bit easier to go from 3 jobs to 2 jobs or from 2 jobs to 1 job. And I think it's important for us to say those people fall into this number. They will be reducing their hours. If you're a 2-parent home, you have kids, you have a sick parent, and you say, well, I'm going to now, because we can afford health care because of the credits or expansion of Medicaid or whatever the case may be, I can reduce my hours that I'm working as a husband or wife to take care of a sick parent. And maybe they don't have to go into a nursing home and draw on the Medicaid program now. None of that is factored into the long-term costs either here, correct? I mean, you don't say, well, a number of these people will reduce their hours and they'll be able to take care of mom instead of her going in a nursing home.
You're right, Congressman. We've not incorporated any effect of that
sort. And I think that's the point. There's so many different scenarios that average people around the country are living with right now, not anymore so much, but have struggled to make ends meet. And the pressure put on these families is being reduced now because of the Affordable Care Act. And I'd just like to say, I think there's been an undertone of disrespect in this hearing, as I sat through it, about people just don't want to go to work. There's always a few people, I'm sure, that will find a way, even if they work, to scam the company or to run a scam. There are always going to be people like that. But for the most part, if there's a job that opens up in our town, and that pays well, there are thousands of applicants who want to take that job. And I hope that we can get away from this idea that, oh, nobody wants to work, everybody just wants to get on the dole, nobody wants to, work for a living. It's not true. And the scenarios we discussed, I think, outline that. And so I appreciate you being very clear that this is not about 2 million jobs. This is about average people having an opportunity to reduce the burden on their own family.
Thank you.
Thank you so
yes,
much.
Congressman.
Dr. Elmendorf, thank you for your time today. The hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you. Those people with the hot dog. I don't very good. Great job.
Congressional Budget Office Director Douglas Elmendorf wrapping up his testimony before the House Budget Committee. He'll likely do that before a Senate panel as well here on C-SPAN 2.